The art of taxation consists of so plucking the goose as to obtain the most feathers with the least possible hissing.
It sounds like everybody's hissing today.
There is a lot of hissing going on across the Western world, and if you start looking at the world through the prism of taxation, you start to see that almost the entire course of civilization was defined by taxation. And in this case, every revolution is usually a rising up against some kind of injustice perpetrated by the tax system. We're obviously in a situation where anger has been growing for at least 10 years. And there are so many economic injustices, and they are perpetrated through the tax system. But it's slightly different today because so many taxes are deducted by stealth, inflation being the most obvious one.
Yeah.
And but they're also conducted, you know, when money is deducted at source, you don't feel it in the same way as if you're taxed 50% on your $100, but you only ever receive $50. It's not the same as you having had $100 and then somebody
back. There's something really psychologically disturbing about that.
So that's a way of being able to increase the feathers without the hissing. And government spending and taxation are directly related. And with everything that's going on with US aid and Elon Musk and Trump desperately trying to cut down US government spending, you know, government spending is the precursor to taxation. And so, yeah, there's a lot of hissing. And there's a lot of anger.
The stuff I read in your book, I mean, you are not taught those things in school, and purposely so, probably.
Taxation is taught as a sort of subsect of economics. But in my view, it should be a subject in itself.
Welcome back to another episode of Cypherpunked, and it's a very important day because we're going to kick off our Daylight Robbery Series, and I'm joined here by one of my favorite authors, Dominic Frisby. Welcome, my friend.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and what a pleasure it is to be here. I flew into Fort Myers Airport yesterday, and I've just been swimming this morning and enjoying the smell of Naples.
Is all this sunshine shocking you a little bit?
It is a bit. I've just come from Palm Springs, which is in the middle of the desert, and but it's a good 5 or 10 degrees warmer here than it is in the desert. It's also a more humid heat.
Yeah, way more humid for sure. Dominic, let's hop into your book. It's one of my favorites, and let's kick it off with the intro quote of the book, which is also funny. I love how you explain it. It always gives me a good chuckle.
Well, the book is called Daylight Robbery. And the expression daylight robbery means brazen theft. But it's actually a book about the history of tax, which in the eyes of many is, is tax theft, or is tax the price we pay for a civilized society? And this is the great argument, and people to the left will say it's the price we pay for a civilized society. And those letters are in fact inscribed on the outside of the IRS building, one of the less civilized government departments. But there are many who argue that tax is theft. And given that most taxes are paid involuntarily, in other words, another body comes along and takes the money without your permission and forcibly takes it, because if you don't pay, you might not be held at gunpoint for the money, but if you don't pay that money, you go to jail.
You're going in the cage.
And so it is forcibly taken. And in many cases and many taxes, they're not even forcibly taken anymore, in the sense that they're taken before you even receive the money. Income tax is taken at source, deducted at source, and similarly sales taxes and so on. They're not deducted at source, but you have to pay that money, otherwise you can't leave the shop with that product. And the shop is obliged to deduct the sales tax, otherwise it gets into trouble. So anyway, so there are many, many parallels between taxation and theft. And so, but this expression daylight robbery, which means brazen theft, it is thought actually has its roots in the window tax that was paid across Western Europe for many hundreds of years. And when there was a big argument in Parliament in 1850, I want to say 1852, but it might have just been 1850, and the problem with the window tax is that it was making people ill because people were losing their sunlight, and landlords were building buildings with no windows at all. And in the Industrial Revolution, in all the cramped dwellings, it was making people ill. And it's argued that MPs, when they were arguing about the issue whether they should get rid of it, MPs cried out daylight robbery, and that's where it's thought the origins of the expression are. Some people say the origins of the expression are with the highwaymen, who are the thieves that would mug you on the roads. Anyway, it's a disputed thing. But anyway, the opening chapter of the quote is written very much from the perspective of the tax taker rather than the taxpayer. And it's an expression from a chap called Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was finance minister to Louis XV Louis XIV in the 17th century. And Louis XIV was a notorious spender for many, many decades, one of France's longest serving kings. But he, like many of France's kings, he left France in a parlous financial state due to his warmongering and profligate spending and so on. But anyway, the quote is this: "The art of taxation consists of so plucking the goose as to obtain the most feathers with the least possible hissing."
I feel like they could learn something from this guy.
Well,
Jean-Baptiste, because today it sounds like everybody's hissing today.
There is a lot of hissing. There is a lot of hissing going on across the Western world, and one of the things I argue in my book is that if you start looking at the world through the prism of taxation, and particularly through history, you start to see that almost the entire course of civilization was defined by taxation. And in this case, every revolution is usually a rising up against some kind of injustice perpetrated by the tax system. And, we're obviously in a situation where anger has been growing for at least 10 years. And there are so many economic injustices, and they are perpetrated through the tax system. But it's slightly different today because so many taxes are deducted by stealth, inflation being the most obvious one.
Yeah.
And but they're also conducted, when money is deducted at source, you don't feel it in the same way as if you're taxed 50% on your $100, but you only ever receive $50. It's not the same as you having had $100 and then somebody
give it back. There's something really psychologically disturbing about that.
So that's a way of being able to increase the feathers without the hissing. But in any case, everything is going on in America, and government spending and taxation are directly related. And with everything that's going on with USAID and Elon Musk and Trump desperately trying to cut down US government spending, government spending is the precursor to taxation. And so, there's a lot of hissing and there's a lot of anger.
I think that's probably one of my favorite things about your book. You're such a great storyteller, which, you think a book about taxes is going to be boring, but when you read your book, you just weave all these narratives and all these things, and you really do give history a look through the lens of taxation. And it really it's very extremely eye-opening. Stuff like this, stuff I read in your book, you are not taught those things in school, and purposely so, probably. But it's fascinating.
Well, I one of the reasons I wrote the book is that I want people to start looking at the world and at history and at human civilization through the prism of taxation.
As they should.
Indeed, they should. And taxation is taught as a sort of subsect of economics. But in my view, it should be a subject in itself.
It is economics in so many ways. It's central to economics.
I think it's bigger than economics.
One of my favorite quotes is, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And, if you operate businesses and have, employees or contractors or staff or people, you really see that play out as you toggle with the incentives of different, payment schemes, or you want them to incentivize them to do certain things, and you play with those levers. And it is so true. If you will get outcomes you did not expect if you don't properly design and align those incentives. And such is true with taxation as well.
Absolutely. Leaders use taxes to toggle the incentives.
Yeah.
And they often backfire. So, for example, you'll often have taxes on, in the UK, and I imagine in the States as well, we have taxes on tobacco, very high taxes on tobacco. And we have high taxes on fuel as well, fossil fuels. And the argument we're given why we pay taxes on fossil fuels is that they're bad for the environment, and therefore we tax them. And the argument on tobacco is that, you know, tobacco is bad for your health, and therefore we're going to tax it. And so they tax it in order to, well, they tax it because they want the money, but they also tax it because they want people to smoke less, and they want to incentivize behavior. But this results in all sorts of different outcomes. So as a result of tobacco taxes, one impact is that people smoke less, but another impact, which I'm sure they didn't factor into their calculations, is that tobacco smuggling increases. So there are often unexpected outcomes indeed. And leaders have used taxes to incentivize behavior. Beard tax is one of the more famous ones. Henry VIII in the UK, quite hypocritically, given that he had a massive beard himself, imposed a beard tax. But Peter the Great in Russia, he decided that Russians weren't sophisticated enough. And one of the ways by which Russians weren't sophisticated was they were wearing these enormous beards. But in fact, you know, Russia is cold, and it makes a lot of sense to wear a beard. But in any case, he imposed this beard tax. And because he wanted, you know, Russians to look like Western, like these sophisticated French and so on. And so he imposed this beard tax. And if you wore a beard, and you hadn't paid the tax, you could be forcibly shaved in public. But to demonstrate that you had paid the tax, you had to wear this little copper token on which it said, "The beard is a superfluous burden."
I love that. That's fascinating. Oh, man. You talk about stoves and fireplaces in people's houses and how they had to basically came in to determine, the tax collectors like went forcibly into people's homes to test and see how many, you know, fireplaces they had. And then I think you even said that one of the Great London Fires itself may have been a result of that. There's rumors that, you know,
I mean,
potentially
this is the Great Fire of London. They still don't know.
They don't know for sure, but
that what caused the fire, and they think it was an oven in a bakery. But what used to happen is, again, everyone had fireplaces back in the day because that's how you kept your house warm, and so they brought in these taxes. This predated William the Conqueror. And they were called smoke farthings. And usually the taxes were paid to the church. But gradually it became a sort of established, it became statute. It became an established thing in the 17th century, the hearth tax. And you were taxed for every fireplace you had in your home, for every hearth, you would have to pay a tax. And so a tax collector would come and check your house twice a year to come inside your house and count the number of fireplaces that you had. And this was a sort of violation of the Englishman's sacred privacy.
Oh, it absolutely isn't a violation of your privacy.
I'd say. And do you imagine, I mean, things were slightly different in those days, but we have in the UK, we have a BBC license fee. And if you haven't paid your license fee...
You're welcome for that, by the way. Apparently we've been paying.
Yeah, you have been covering some of the charges.
We've been covering the charges out of my own dollars.
And you wonder why the BBC is so biased. But anyway, but yeah, if you haven't paid the license fee, a tax the license checker, whatever his name is, the investigator can come into your house to check and see if you've got a functioning TV or not. And I've had it done to me because I didn't pay my license fee, and
I wouldn't go over well here in America.
Oh, can you imagine? It's a real imposition.
Yeah.
And I've had it done to me. I remember this was about 25 years ago, when we were students, even longer, and we were students, and we hadn't paid the license fee because we're students, and students always bunk off. And I remember I had my feet up, and I was watching the World Cup on the telly, and one of my flatmates opened the door, and it was a license fee guy, and he just opened the door and invited him in, and I was literally caught red-handed watching the telly. Anyway, but in the case of hearth taxes, the English hated it. They absolutely hated it. And we had this thing called the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which is when the Bill of Rights was eventually signed and composed and signed. But the king was James II, was a Catholic king, and he was overthrown by William of Orange, William from Holland, and he had this. It was called the Glorious Revolution, and it was basically the end of the English Civil War, which had been going on for many, many decades. The Civil War technically ended with Oliver Cromwell, but the change of rule that happened in England, it took almost 100 years, say 80 years to fully fledge. But in any case, William marched into London, and to ingratiate himself with the newly conquered people, he repealed this loathed half tax. And so that, of course, made him incredibly popular. But within 6 or 7 years, William had lots of wars to wage in the continent. The Irish were causing problems. The French were causing problems. The Scots were causing problems. And he had wars to fight, and he had a crown to pay for. But at this point, tax collection was controlled by Parliament. It wasn't controlled by the Crown anymore. This is one of the results of the Civil War. And this is why it's such a key subject, because tax is power. And it doesn't matter if you're king, parliament, government, emperor. If you lose your tax revenue, you lose your power. That is what makes your rule possible.
Don't get me so excited.
Tax is power, tax is control. And so withholding taxes is a way of starving the monster. Now, and the realities of 21st century finance are that it is very hard to withhold your taxes because taxes are paid at source and so on. But and you get thrown in jail. But in any case, Parliament controlled taxes, and because we'd been through decades of civil war, it was very hard for William to get to finance his crown. And one of the ways he financed it was with the founding of the Bank of England and the birth of central banking, which is a whole new means of funding government. But in any case, so the infrastructure to collect hearth taxes was already in place. And so they had this idea, instead of taxing fireplaces, they would tax windows instead, because this was a way of extracting more feathers without hissing, if you see what I mean, because the tax collector only need walk past the house and count the number of windows rather than go inside the house and invade the privacy. It was an impossible tax to evade because your house is there. You can't sort of hide your house. And so this new tax was brought in I want to say 1696.
You hit the nail on the head. That is the year.
Oh, okay, good. My memory's not that bad. And it lasted from 1696 until 1850. 250 years it lasted. And already by, say, by 1718, the tax wasn't generating as much revenue as they hoped. So already within 20 years. And instead of just getting rid of the tax, what they did was what leaders always do, is they increased it. And but one of the many unintended consequences of the tax was that it made people ill, because the tax fell on the landlord, and so landlords simply built buildings with no windows. Yeah. And in the cramped, damp, windowless dwellings of the cities in the Industrial Revolution, as people were moving from the countryside to the cities, it made the cases of cholera and typhus and all the other diseases, made it much worse. And there was no electricity in those days. People only had, tallow candles and so on. And so the loss of daylight was a huge sacrifice.
Daylight robbery.
It was indeed daylight robbery. But even though the tax wasn't generating as much revenue as they wanted, and even though and they had all sorts of scientific studies carried out that demonstrated that this tax was making people ill from as early as the early 1800s.
Wow.
And yet government would not get rid of it. And there were songs sang, there were campaigns. Charles Dickens, one of the great authors, railed against it. And there were these huge, huge campaigns, and still government wouldn't get rid of it. But then eventually they did, 250 years later.
It reminds me of the all the stuff that was happening with COVID, and people are out on the beach, like, trying to get some sunlight, and the cops are coming in California, like, arresting them, leaving all the drug addicts and all the community parks and stuff. It's just wild.
There's that fantastic picture that was taken of the guy doing, in a lotus position, doing yoga on the beach, and all these really fat coppers looking in really bad shape, surrounding him with guns.
Yeah, wild. But the window tax definitely seemed more fair than the hearth tax, I guess, from the level of, obviously if you're more wealthy, you have a larger house, you probably have more windows. And it's also less invasion of privacy. So
it was fairer, except for the fact that if you lived in the country, you had a house, you tended to have a bigger house with more windows.
Yeah.
But if you lived in a city, you would have a smaller house with fewer windows. But the fact that people in the city were much richer than the people in the country. So in that sense, it was inequitable. But it was sort of, you felt like it was progressive, even though it wasn't.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting about the window tax is that in its evolution, you see the life cycle of every tax. And it was enacted at a time of need, usually to pay for some kind of war. It was presented as temporary, but it becomes permanent. The amount payable was low at first, but it increased over time. It violates basic freedoms, in this case, the right to light and fresh air. Many went to huge lengths to avoid paying it, and in this case, blocking up windows. And you see in architecture, houses were built. It informed architecture. Houses were built.
To me is fascinating. For literally centuries, it literally changed the architecture of an era, of a civilization. It's wild.
Yeah, and it decimated the glass. There was a tax on glass as well. It decimated the glass industry.
Yeah,
and so.
People painted fake windows.
They did. They painted fake windows to make themselves look richer than they were. That's so funny. An aspirational village did that. But they would also build houses with the windows blocked up, and then the owner of the house could then had the option to knock out if they wanted to.
Yeah.
So because people go to lengths to avoid paying it, it distorts how people behave, the decisions they make, and the unintended consequences get worse and worse as the tax matures. And of course, the money that gets raised is spent in a way with which the person paying it doesn't always agree.
Of course, yeah. That's one of the the most immoral and unethical things.
That's the big problem I have with taxes is you work hard and you pay this money and then it gets spent on some stupid bureaucratic procedure.
$2 million missile to shoot a fucking balloon out of the sky. It's like
no, don't want my money.
It's
spent
like
on that.
That was like $2 million. That like 20 people worked their whole lives to pay that. And you fucking just shoot a missile out of the fucking sky, a balloon out of the sky with a $2 million or $5 million missile. I mean, that just blows my fucking mind.
Let me ask you a question. What is the most expensive purchase you ever make in your life?
Your government.
Absolutely right. Most people say your house. But over the course of your life, more than half of everything you earn.
I learned that from this book I read by this author named Dominic Frisby.
So let me just finish on the life cycle and then
go for it.
And so finally, people have had enough. There's a movement, a campaign, a protest, even a revolution to get rid of the tax, which government is slow and reluctant to do.
It sounds really familiar, like something like that's happening right now.
It's happening right now.
Is it called Doge? Doge?
It's
people don't want to fund transgender surgeries in Honduras anymore.
It's quite beautiful because even though a lot of people are up in arms about it, this revolution is happening quite peacefully by the standards of previous revolutions. And it is a revolution that's happening. And it's wonderful to witness. In fact, I want to move to the States because I want to be part of this.
Yeah.
There's a new country being born here. It's just wonderful. Now, it's too simplistic to say the window tax was good or bad because it worked for a bit and then it didn't work. And the money that was raised helped pay for, defense of the nation. And at its heart, there was the moral dilemma of so many taxes. On the one hand, it was an invasion of private property rights with unintended consequences. It was theft. But on the other hand, it was the most practical solution at the time to pay for, the vital workings of government. Now, as a libertarian, you go, well, what government is vital? But, So Winston Churchill described taxes as a necessary evil.
Necessary evil, yeah.
And the big question is, how much evil is necessary? But that's the sort of the life cycle of a tax. And, some taxes, one of the reasons that they were able to get rid of the window tax in the UK is bizarrely what they replaced it with. They got rid of, we had hundreds of petty taxes and we got rid of a lot of them and just introduced income tax instead. So, you know, but again, income tax was temporary. The amounts payable were low at first, and then it just...
Yeah, I think Elon shared or somebody shared a chart of this to show when it first came out. There was actually a post about it. We talked about it on the Runway, I think, our other podcast. And yeah, it just kind of shows like when the income tax, at least in the United States, when it first came, and there was this need, it was the war, this, that, and the other. And it's only going to affect 1% of the population, the billionaires. That's how it starts, right? And then you just see over time, now it's everybody, right?
Income tax in the States, people think income tax first came in 1913.
1913, yeah.
And funnily enough, one of the things that income tax enabled in 1913 was prohibition. Because there was quite high sales taxes on alcohol at the time. And one of the reasons they couldn't get prohibition over the line was that was the loss of tax revenue to the government of no alcohol taxes. And in fact, but income tax would replace the loss of alcohol. So the prohibitionists became massive campaigners for income tax.
Wow.
But again, in 1913, it didn't affect every man. It was only in 1942, with the Revenue Act of 1942, that taxes came to ordinary Americans. And that was, of course, to pay for World War II. And Irving Berlin, the songwriter, was commissioned to write a song celebrating income tax in 1942. And there was a video with Donald Duck paying his income tax.
That,
but Irving Berlin, and the song was a happy song going, I paid my income tax today. And it contained the line, 1,000 planes to bomb Berlin. They've got to be paid for, and I chipped in. And that was the line. And you'd like right there, you can see the link between tax and war.
Yeah.
And then again, the Revenue Act of 1942, it was erected at a time of crisis, World War II, to pay for a war, essential need, blah, blah, blah. But once the tax was there, it never went away.
Never went away.
Quantitative easing was the same. Pay for the panic of 2009. You know, quantitative easing is taxation by inflation, effectively. But it was, financial crisis, yada, yada. And they only stopped doing it. You know, it was done on a temporary basis, 2009. 10 years later, they were still quantitative easing. I think they're still doing it in the UK. And actually, they've just stopped now.
They got all their little fancy terms. We're quantitative easing right now, and then we're doing quantitative tapering. And then, you know, at the end of the day,
the word quantitative, it's just classic obfuscation. But people in the States don't think this. You think you got your first income tax in 1913. You didn't. Your first income tax came in 1862.
Really?
Imposed by a certain Abraham Lincoln. And the reason it was imposed was Lincoln was obsessed with protecting Union revenue. And in fact, as we'll discover in one of the later episodes, I argue that was the main reason for the Civil War.
Yeah.
It's certainly an untold reason. We'll do it in a later episode. But he gave you income tax for the very first time.
Yeah.
He also introduced this thing, which I understand Trump might get rid of, which is that an American citizen, if they are an American citizen, even if they don't live in the States, wherever they are in the world, they have to pay taxes in America, back to America. And that was, again, brought in 1862, Abraham Lincoln, to protect Union revenue during the Civil War.
So I remember
got rid of.
I remember reading something about it that it I guess maybe, Paul, you can look this up because we talked about this on the X Spaces the other day. But I remember Bill Clinton did something where he added that back. I guess maybe it did go away and then he brought it back.
Like magic, I'm being fed the information. Bill Clinton didn't bring it back. He reimposed it.
Ah, okay.
So he reinforced it. So he had an I guess so, or reminded people that it was there. So it never went away. But Trump's talked about getting rid of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
it makes life difficult for American citizens not in the
US. I mean, there's something very un-American about that, right? It just seems very like, our nation was founded on like unjust taxation and like, I mean, it's kind of wild.
Yeah, well, it was, and many nations were. And you wonder how much revenue they actually generate from it, whether it's actually worth doing. But then you have to ask, if it wasn't the case, then how many Americans would leave America and go and become digital nomads? The digital nomad lifestyle, which is it's going to be, a lot of people are going to be digital nomads in the future. It's the fastest growing workforce in the world.
Yeah. Reminds me of the sovereign individual.
It's
Such
exactly
a
what
book.
it exactly
Those
what they
guys.
are.
I mean, that was also like just such a fantastic book to talk about all this stuff. And when you think back, those guys wrote that book like in the 90s. Like that is just so. They predicted Bitcoin, all these different. That's just fascinating.
Totally prescient.
Yeah.
That lifestyle of the sovereign individual is not currently open to Americans. But if Americans want to be part of this, in the international workforce, Trump will enable them to if he rescinds that law.
Yeah. I think if you want to attract business, like, and again, this brings us to our next chapter about the fragrant harbor, about the fragrant harbor. But this idea of letting capital flow freely, letting people flow freely, in the sense that you can't force things. You want to provide incentives to attract business, attract people, which is what I like. So
yeah, Cooperthwaite was the great governor of Hong Kong, financial secretary of Hong Kong. We'll talk about him in a sec. But one of his lines was, "Money comes here because it knows it can leave if it wants."
Yeah, I love that. So Hong Kong stands for Fragrant Harbor. I did not know that, which I get all these like interesting little tidbits from your book. But I guess why was it called that? Because there was perfume factories or something.
Perfume factories on the seafront, and that's how it got its name. But Hong Kong Pong, it doesn't sound like a particularly nice smelling place, but that's where it got its name. And incredible story to Hong Kong is it's just sort of some craggy rocks, and there's no metal to mine. There's no natural resources.
Not a naturally resource rich area.
It's nothing to grow. The only thing it's got is this deep, naturally occurring deep port. And I think at one stage it was Portuguese explorers settled there, and then they left, and it with the sort of isolationist policies of the Ming dynasty, it sort of fell into nothing. And then at some point in the 19th century, the English got hold of it, and or maybe it was in the 18th century. It was in the Opium Wars in the 19th century, and the British took control of it. And then we didn't bother defending it in World War II.
The Japanese just came in and took it.
They just like literally walked in and took it. And Churchill, he deemed it just wasn't. Obviously, it's quite a long way. We've got to send fleet a long way,
regardless.
Yeah, and so we just let them take it, and for whatever reason, mainly how to deploy resources. And I think at the time it was seen as quite scandalous, and I think the people in Hong Kong felt quite betrayed, and many of them ended up in Japanese concentration camps, which were pretty grim places.
Read a couple of books about that.
And if you're an English prisoner of war in a German concentration camp, you were not treated that badly compared to how other prisoners were treated, because of the Germans had respect for the English that they didn't say have for Slavs or for Jews or something like that. So you weren't that badly. I'm not saying you were well treated. You weren't, but the Japanese had no such. Yeah, and I think as an Englishman in a German concentration camp, I think you had the death rate was maybe 3 or 4%, but in a Japanese one, it was more than 30%.
Yeah,
so that's quite a big difference.
I remember the name of that book I read. It was like the guy escaped. I think he was in a down plane, and it was a pretty well-known book.
Yeah, the American guy.
Yeah,
and he was a runner.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Unbroken is the name of the book. Louis Zamperini.
I remember. Fascinating story.
So 1944. The war's ending, 1945. They've dropped the bomb, and nobody's quite thought about what happens to Hong Kong. So the guy who was called Franklin Gimson, he was the secretary of Hong Kong at the beginning of the war, and he walked straight out of the concentration camp, walked straight back into the city, and just established that the British now controlled Hong Kong again. He just established it, and just one of those things. Everyone just sort of accepted it. But
I mean, it kind of made sense because they had it before.
Right? It made sense, but he was leaving no room for doubt.
Yeah, I gotcha.
Inspired, those kind of decisions. It's amazing how those kind of decisions, taken at key moments in history, can define entire civilization.
Yeah.
And in any case, So Hong Kong was British. And I think at the end of the war, there were just 600,000 people there. And it was totally destitute. And its per capita GDP, for example.
Poorest on the planet from my research.
Maybe not the poorest on the planet, but as low as many parts of Africa, sub-Saharan
Bottom 1%, basically.
Yeah, like as down and out as it gets.
Yeah.
And a team of civil servants was sent out to get the colony back on its feet. And one of them was this Scottish chap called John James Cowperthwaite, who had studied classics, but he'd also studied Adam Smith and the Enlightenment. He was it said he went to bed with a copy of Wealth of Nations by his bedside, a massive Adam Smith fan. And if you're not familiar with Adam Smith, he was like the Enlightenment philosopher who is seen as the father of capitalism.
Yeah.
Very pro-free markets and all that kind of thing.
I've never actually seen his name because I listened to the audiobook because you narrate all your own audiobooks. I'm a big audiobook guy. But how do you spell that? Okay.
You spell his name
Cowperthwaite.
Cowperthwaite.
Wow, that's fascinating.
But I think it's pronounced Cowperthwaite.
I was thinking it was a K-U-P, but no. Wow. That's awesome.
Cowperthwaite.
I couldn't find any information because I couldn't look up his name.
British name. And so their job was to get industry up and running again. And Cowperthwaite was a very observant man. He just used to walk around the streets, and he just made the observation that so the governor, Gimson, decided that Hong Kong was going to be a free port, no taxes on anything bar a few commodities, no export subsidies, no import restrictions. And so imports and exports got back on their feet pretty quickly. No taxes, nothing to inhibit the flow of trade. And Cowperthwaite was quite observant. He would walk the streets, look at what was going on, talk to people and so on. And he observed that things were getting back on their feet without the government having to do anything. And it was an observation he was quite happy to make. But his other task, he ran a department that was responsible for getting essential supplies to the island. So it had to buy and sell food and fuel and that kind of thing and administer price controls. And the department was just total chaos. And it taught him, it was just a mess from the word go. And it just taught him how bad bureaucrats were in business, operating business.
Oh, yeah, no doubt.
And
we see it every day that Elon and his team discover some new scam or scandal or nonsense.
Yeah. And he gave us a great quote, "I trust the commercial judgment only of those who are themselves taking the risks."
Ah, that's fantastic.
When government gets into a business, it tends to make it uneconomic for anyone else. So he began developing this theory, and he called it positive non-intervention.
Yeah.
Isn't that a great word?
I love that. I did a series with Aaron Van Weerdum, and we went through his book, the Genesis book, which talks about all the stuff that led up to Bitcoin, but the economic theories as well. And it reminds me of this idea of spontaneous order. It's this concept essentially that you don't want to plan all of these things because all the signals that the free market is sending, right? You might not be able to understand it rationally, but price acts as this signal, this like spontaneous order, and it just reminds me of this idea, this concept where you talk about positive non-intervention.
Well, absolutely right, and it derives from Adam Smith. Adam Smith called it the invisible hand. And Paul, I'm going to ask you to get that Adam Smith quote, the full quote about Adam Smith's invisible hand, up, and we can read it out because it's a great quote. Put the glasses on.
Oh, it's a long quote.
It's not going to be
By
long.
preferring the support.
No. Let's get. Okay, I'll read it out to you in my lovely English accent.
Okay.
By preferring, he intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. So we're all acting in our own self-interest. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it.
I love that.
It's the accident, the unintended consequence. So, you're in the Bitcoin mining business, and it's in your interests to mine Bitcoin as effectively and as cheaply as you possibly can. But by mining Bitcoin cheaply and effectively, Bitcoin itself benefits, and Bitcoin benefits while the rest of society benefits, because Bitcoin is a much better form of money than fiat. So you, acting in your own self-interest to run a good mining operation, end up making society better.
Yeah. And not even that. I mean, there's other unintended consequences. For example, we're seeking out green energy, promoting green energy. So there's all these other things because we want the lowest cost of energy. Well, and we're using energy 24/7. It just so happens that renewable energy seems to fit that bucket. We're one of the few use cases who's going to subsidize the cost of that infrastructure.
This is what the left totally failed to realize, that just because something uses a lot of energy, that does not mean it is a bad thing. In fact, you can measure the sophistication of a society by the amount of energy that it uses. And the more energy a society consumes, the more sophisticated that society is, and the better at consuming energy that society gets. So the fact that Bitcoin requires a lot of energy means we are going to get better at producing energy. It's Adam Smith all over again.
I love it.
So he used to say, Cooperthwaite used to say, clumsy bureaucratic fingers should be kept out of the sensitive mechanism of the economy. It is better to rely on the hidden hand. And I love this quote. A multiplicity of individual decisions by businessmen and industrialists will produce a better and wiser result than a single decision by a government or by a board with its inevitably limited knowledge of the myriad factors involved and its inflexibility.
Spontaneous order.
Absolutely. It's gold. And what's interesting is that Hong Kong's tax policies over that period were the direct opposite of what Britain and Western Europe pursued. We presumed we had high taxes, a lot of government spending, deficit financing, industrial planning, economic intervention, all the rest of it. And Hong Kong went the other way. No income tax at all, except for the very wealthy. And even the highest earners only paid 15%. No tariffs, no duties, no sales taxes, no VAT, no capital gains tax, no taxes on your interest, on your overseas earnings. But there was one tax called land value tax.
I was going to ask you about that.
Which we'll talk about that in a later episode. But the overall tax burden never exceeded 14% of GDP. So you're going, and most of the time it's around about 10%. So you're right back at the historical tithe.
That 10% number seems to stand the test of time.
10, 15%. Even if you offered me 20%, I'd bite your hand off. But in any case, and they think that the tithe, by the way, the 10% thing comes from the fact that we have 10 fingers on our hand.
Yeah.
And it's just an easy number to calculate. And Cooperthwaite's idea was that taxes should be low, and as a result of the increased trade, more revenue would eventually come to government coffers. So this idea that low taxes lead to greater government revenue, which governments today in the UK, they've increased taxes thinking that's going to increase revenue.
They always forget this throughout history, yeah.
It does not.
I'm reading back to I think it was like the fourth caliph or something. Even like understood that they just have to rediscover this every time. And
they do
with the Laffer curve, but we'll cover that in another chapter. But
sure,
what I found truly fascinating about this was that Hong Kong was like one of the most poorest places on the planet, and then over this couple decades even it went from the poorest per capita, like one of the poorest per capita per person, to surpassing the United States, the UK. And to become the wealthiest per capita per citizen.
It's quite incredible. And not only the wealthiest per capita, but with the best government services.
Yeah. Fascinating.
And we'll quickly trace through that journey.
I mean, they weren't like number one and everything, but they were top 5 in like all these categories.
Still are.
Fantastic. Yeah. Unbelievable. I mean, that's like, blows your mind.
Low taxes. Keynes was not writing with our situation in mind, he would always say. No national debt. He said, national debt is the surest precursor of high taxation, he would say. I think Elon Musk says exactly the same thing. So did Milton Friedman. and I love this line, I am skeptical of the theory that we have a right to pass on our capital burdens to future generations.
I love that.
Our predecessors had not passed any significant part of their burden on to us.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. Debt is a tax on the future.
It's unbelievable. You know, I just hit my 30s, so I'm like seeing all the stuff that's gone on before, and I'm coming in and seeing all this, you know, what, $40 trillion in debt or something crazy, and you know, just the load that, you know, our previous generations are leaving to us, you know, as we're millennials, we're coming into our prime earning years over the next decade, and just kind of like seeing this huge disaster. It's like, what the hell is happening? What is going on? Who set all this stuff up? You know, it's crazy.
Well, it's wonderful what Elon Musk is doing, and he gets it. And one of the reasons that you have all this debt and this taxation is now being exposed by USAID, USAID, whatever it's called, is the subsidization of all these not only crazy businesses, but you know, left-wing propaganda.
I mean, this is totally antithetical to the Constitution of the United States. I mean, it's a direct violation of the First Amendment. So they think they can just get around doing the stuff that they're not allowed to do by setting up these NGOs, which are funded by the government. So they're really not NGOs. They're really just, you know, shadowy government organizations. You know, this is like what they'd call they got all these shell companies. These are government shell companies is really what they are. I mean, that's, you know, that's what's happening.
Unbelievable. It's unbelievable, but Thwaite knew. And here's what he said. I confess my distaste for any proposal to use public funds for the support of selected and thereby privileged industrialists, the more particularly if this is to be based on bureaucratic views of what is good and what is bad. I do not believe that any body of men can have enough knowledge of the past, the present, and the future to establish development priorities. I should have thought a desirable industry was almost by definition one which could establish itself and thrive without special assistance in ordinary market conditions.
Oh, this is so good.
It's gold.
So prescient. And like, as a business operator who has multiple businesses, and we haven't touched on this yet, but the tax code, like here in the United States even, like I'm told by all my people, like people that I hire to do my books and my accountants, and I'm paying all these people to do all this stuff, and they're like, you know, don't do this, don't do that. I'm like, how the fuck can any reasonable person understand any of this? I mean, it is insane. It's literally insane. So they're like, oh, you know, well, guess what? You go to tax court, you have to defend like, how am I going to defend myself about something that I can't even understand? Like, it's great. I'm like, this is why I'm paying you guys to figure all this out. This is, it's literally insane.
Yeah.
I mean, it's literally if they want to go after you and get you, they're going to be able to get you on something. You know what I mean? And that's like, show me the person. It's like, that reminds me of that like Stalinist quote. Show me the person and I'll show you the crime. It's like, seriously, I mean, there's no way to escape that, you know, with your taxes. So it's like, anytime I see like, oh, we got this guy for tax this or tax that, it's like, that's the way they get you when they can't get you any other way. So I'm just putting it out there so I can play this recording. If they ever take me to tax court, I'm going to play this and say, look, like, you know, this is ridiculous. This is insane.
I know.
You know?
I can't bear how much money I spend and how many industries there are that have emerged simply to meet government bureaucratic requirements.
Yeah,
they're not actually creating
any value. Yeah, it's just total parasittism.
Yeah.
It's like
well, the Hong Kong tax code, it's like you think you're big in America. Well, our tax code is bigger than yours.
That's insane.
The UK has the longest tax code in the world. I think it's equivalent to all 7 Harry Potter books 15 times over.
I mean, that is unfathomable.
It's like 13
That's
Bibles or something.
That is unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. And nobody's read it all. And most of it's unreadable. The Hong Kong tax code was 1.5% of the UK's.
Yeah.
1.5%.
Yeah.
And it was less than 300 pages.
Which still seems
150,000
like
words. It does seem like a lot, but it was so simple.
Of the US,
and it's easy to set it. Yeah. It would be easy to set up a company. And the other thing he did is he pegged the currency to the pound, the Hong Kong currency, the Hong Kong dollar. He pegged it to the pound.
I love this.
But he wouldn't tell anyone how he did it.
Did they ever figure out how he did it, or
He must have done at some point. And HSB did it, and he just knew that they'd mess it up.
And sure enough, they did.
Yeah, so he just said, better they shouldn't know. And there were no capital controls either, as we said.
Yeah.
Now, this was all possible because it wasn't a democracy. It was a sort of benevolent dictatorship or a civil service that happened to be run by a guy who just was religious about Adam Smith and all the rest of it. And it wasn't just him, it was everyone around him. But you know, you go to Hong Kong, we haven't heard of this guy, Cooperthwaite. You go to Hong Kong, he is like a god.
A god, yeah.
You know, he's one of the founding fathers. And
yeah, I mean, he's unbelievable. I mean, it sounds like it's crazy that there aren't more case studies of people learning from this. It looks like the Chinese did learn from this, and we can touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, they did indeed. But if you just, we'll come back to your first thing of how Hong Kong grew. And so this is the beautiful thing. You cannot precisely calculate how much Hong Kong grew on a per capita basis because of the fact that Cooperthwaite would not allow government statistics of any kind. And I think an African leader once asked him at some conference, if we want to turn our country into your country and be as successful as you, what do we do? And he said, the first thing you should do is abolish the Office of National Statistics because it only creates meddling. And if I let them compute those statistics, they'll want to use them for planning. So he literally cut off the supply before it even started. And some British officials at one point came over to ask him why he wasn't calculating employment statistics, and he sent them back on the next plane.
My favorite is the one guy he did where he just dragged them along for like 8 years.
He hired this at one point. He had to hire that. He hired.
That's
this
what they do to us now.
Yeah,
you know?
He hired this professor to calculate the statistics, and every year the professor would come back with his latest measurements. And he'd go, no, you've missed that, and you've missed that. And so the professor would have to go away. And then after 9 years, the professor realized he was just a fool guy.
Yeah.
And Cooperthwaite kept having to go back to government and go, no, he can't, the statistics, he's missed this and he's missed that. Anyway, 1945, Hong Kong was destitute, broken, people were starving, its population had been decimated. And it had so many hurdles. Like in the 50s, there was civil war in China, in mainland China. And so it remained a shanty town. And the previous trade that it had built up, exporting stuff to China, just completely died. But then a load of people came from China and they bought their skills in the cotton industry. And so suddenly Hong Kong remodeled itself as a center of textiles. It kept remodeling itself all of this time. But we know in the 40s, its per capita GP was about $300, so on a par with Asia. By 1960, it was only 429, so it had grown by 50%, which is a lot, but it wasn't huge. And that compared to 429 in Hong Kong, 1,400 in the UK, 3,000 in the US. Okay, so the US has got almost 10 times higher, not a bit less, 8 times higher. And by the, I want to say it overtook UK per capita in the 80s, and in the 90s, it overtook the US. And so within 50 years, it had gone from shantytown to being one of the 10 richest nations in the world within 50 years. That's not even 2 generations, or maybe it's 2 generations. All because of this low tax policy. And that, by the way, I think is what is coming to the US as a result of everything that Trump and Elon Musk
I hope so.
It's just so exciting. It's what's going to happen in Argentina as well.
Oh, Argentina's fantastic. Malay's
and
godsend.
The government ran a surplus every single year, bar one.
What's a surplus?
It took in more money than it spent.
I don't understand.
Sorry, of course you understand.
That's not a thing here.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, I'm just kidding. Florida is probably one of the few states that actually runs a surplus, believe it or not.
And it's the one that has low taxes.
Yep, we have no state income tax here, so.
And he said, and so it just happens every year Hong Kong runs a surplus. And there's a Washington DC think tank called the Heritage Foundation, and it compiles an index of economic freedom for 186 countries around the world. Hong Kong always comes top.
Yeah,
and it has its public transport is the world's best, 99.9% on time success rate.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine that? 99%.
Yeah.
94% of the population live within a mile of a train station. So almost everyone lives within walking distance of a train station. It has supremely good education, supremely good healthcare. It has its longevity is one of the longest in the world. So it's just an incredible success story.
Yeah. I mean,
and it all happened on the back of low taxes. And then because it was so successful, and you touched on this a second ago, Singapore copied it, Taiwan copied it, Japan started to copy it, and even China itself. Everyone thought that, when Hong Kong, like the British, we had a 100-year lease on Hong Kong that was signed with the Chinese in the 1880s or in the 1890s. And to everyone's surprise, when the lease ran out, we honoured it and returned Hong Kong to China in 1998. And everyone thought that would be the end of Hong Kong. And to an extent it is. But in fact,
what's going on now over there? I mean, like,
I don't know the full details. But the surprising thing is that since 1998, when we handed it back, everyone thought Hong Kong would be annexed by China. But if anything, the reverse is happening.
Yeah.
And the capitalist principles of Hong Kong have spread into China. And so we have this incredible growth of China since the turn of the century, which Mao, socialism with Chinese characteristics or whatever he spelt. Whatever he said.
Shenzhen is the one special.
Yeah, and they built
we do business with Shenzhen. We're talking to people over there doing stuff, so.
And Shenzhen was to copy Hong Kong, and it's replicated it, and it's been incredibly successful. But, I know China's extremely authoritarian. It's got a myriad of problems. But if you compare China now compared to China in, at the turn of the century, it's been transformed. So many people have been lifted out of poverty and all the rest of it. And it's because instead of China annexing Hong Kong it's gone the other way. So it's just been incredible. And Cooperthwaite was so humble about it. I did very little. All I did was try to prevent some of the things that might undo it. And that's Cooperthwaite, and that's Hong Kong.
I think that's a good place to
and that's
conclude this episode.
I know life is a lot better today because of technology, and we're liberated because I can talk to anyone in the world on my phone and I can drive anywhere and blah, blah, blah. In that sense, we're freer and more liberated, more powerful, and life is a lot better. But in terms of the amount of time taken from us and the amount of our labour we actually own, our existence is no different to the medieval serf.
It's a little wild.
And taxes permeate everything we do. Wars, conquests, religion, tax is behind everything. And then there's always this moral question. Like, I'm working this hard, and half of what I work for is going to the government. And then the government are then using that money to spend on things that I don't agree with.
Yeah, that's the big one.
I don't agree with going to war.
Yeah.
In such and such a place. I don't agree with the military-industrial complex. I don't agree with sponsoring such and such US aid or whatever it is. Well, tough titty.
Yeah.
We say that tax is the price you pay for a civilized society, and that's written into the brick on the outside of the IRS building, and that is the accepted thing. Taxes are the price. Is that civilized? Forced labor, but you know what I mean, for something you don't agree with.
Yeah. Welcome back to another episode of Cypherpunked. I'm here for our second episode of the Daylight Robbery Series with Dominic Frisby. Welcome back to the show, my friend.
Thank you very much, sir.
So, why tax?
So, taxation is older than civilization itself. The famous line from Benjamin Franklin is that the two things that are inevitable are death and taxes. And he wasn't actually the first to say that. The first to say that was a chap called Christopher Bullock in an old farce. And 'tis impossible to be sure of anything but death and taxes. Both are inevitable. And even in the hunter-gatherer societies that predated civilization, there would have been this sense of duty to the greater collective. And so people would have donated their services and their produce to their, 150 group families, however large the group was that we traveled in. But it's thought we used to roughly.
What's that number called?
It's the magic family number, 150. I can't remember what it's called.
I'll say it's not Darwin's number, but it's.
No, it's not Darwin's, but it does begin with a D.
Dunbar's number. There it is. We knew. We were right. We were close.
Dunbar's number.
Dunbar's number. Which is another just fascinating concept.
So I said in the last episode that taxation is taught as a subset of economics. In fact, it's bigger than economics. And you're talking about this thing in life that is as inevitable as death. And there has never been a civilization that did not have taxation of some kind. Never. And yet, we don't hardly talk about taxation. It's just sort of this thing that accountants deal with, and that's it. And the morality of taxes, each different types of tax, there's all sorts of moral implications of each type of tax. They're barely discussed. And so my aim with this book was to just literally change the Overton window, get people talking about tax again, thinking about tax. Because once you look at the world through the prism of taxation, your perception of everything changes.
You just don't go back.
And you shape a society. Civilizations are shaped by the way they are taxed. You design a society the way you tax it. You design all the incentives. You determine a nation's destiny by the way you tax it, whether its people are going to be rich or poor, prosperous, whether they're going to be free, whether they're going to be subordinated, whether they're going to be happy, whether they're going to be depressed, whether they're going to be inventive. It's all determined by the system of tax. And I said in the last episode, tax is power. Whether it's a king or an emperor or a government, if you cut off their tax revenue, you cut off their power. But it's also control. Tax is how you control the world. And it applies taxes are the fuel on which a society runs. And then you start looking at history, and then you go, every single war in history, from ancient Mesopotamia through to the Ukraine war today, has been paid for by some kind of tax, either during or after the event. The aim of every conqueror in history, from some guy in ancient Mesopotamia to Alexander the Great to Donald Trump wanting to take Greenland, is to take control of the tax base, the land, the labor, the produce, the profit. There's a great George Bernard Shaw quote: "Taxes are the chief business of a conqueror of the world." When Genghis Khan,
this is my favorite one.
Yeah, Genghis Khan used to murder everyone.
Yeah, just kill.
He conquered.
He conquered, just take.
And he took control of China, and he had this advisor called Yeliu Chutsai or something like that. I've pronounced it wrong, and he said that dead peasants
don't pay
considerably less tax than living peasants. And with that little bit of
Classic.
tax advice, probably the greatest bit of tax advice ever given, millions and millions of people were saved.
Just that little bit of advice saved millions of lives.
Wonderful.
That's wild.
And then every revolution, every revolt has been a revolt against some kind of injustice perpetrated by the tax system. No taxation without representation, the American one, the obvious one.
Taxes truly define history.
They really do. And it just, once you look at history, and even things like taxation is at the base of almost every religion. Mary and Joseph were only in Bethlehem to pay taxes. If Augustus
so can you unpack that a little bit? I was trying to.
Well, if
you use some words that weren't familiar to my English vernacular when I listened to that part.
Okay, well, I can't remember what words they were, but
me either. But I was like, what does he mean here by this?
So
I didn't really quite get it.
It was in some versions of the Bible, they were there for a census, which is like a measuring of the population. But the census would have been taken for the purposes of taxing people. But they were there to pay taxes. Augustus Caesar levied a tax, and they were there to pay their taxes. And if he hadn't imposed that bit of taxation, they would have not gone to Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And so there would have,
there'd have been no Jesus.
Well, and then it was non-payment of taxes, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, was the crime for which he was eventually crucified.
Yeah.
And the whole issue is whether Christ is a king, because this was an issue because the Romans would tolerate other religions, but they would not tolerate other kings because kings had a claim on tax revenue, which the Romans were anxious to protect. So there's
we're going to unpack that, I think, in a couple future chapters.
Well, I think it's going to be in this later in this episode, but it's right there at the birth of Christianity. And then similarly, the persecution of the Jews in ancient Egypt, and indeed the persecution of the Jews in Nazi Germany,
I think that's
began with taxes.
I think it's chapter 5 of your book.
You know it better than me. But it began with taxes, and then eventually it went from taxes to being turned into slaves, and then eventually Moses freed them and led them out of Egypt, and then when they were in the Sinai, he was paid a visit by God, and then we got the Ten Commandments, they were tax exiles.
Yeah.
So there's a tax story, and then similarly there's another, which we will come to, there's another tax story at the founding of Islam. The reason Islam was so successful so quickly was low taxes.
Yeah.
And even things like first men on the moon, assuming that they did go there in 1969, and let's, for the purposes of this, assume they did.
I mean, 1969, that seems like a number to just try.
Well, the more the more we progress, the more doubtful I become. But in any case, NASA was a tax fund.
It had to be 1969. It had to be 69.
Well, it's the year I was born, so that's what I
love it. I love it.
And even things like, women getting the vote, women's suffrage. The reason that it was justified that women should get the vote was that they had started paying taxes during World War I, because the men were out fighting, the women had started doing their jobs, and they started paying taxes. And the big argument was Parliament, well, they're paying taxes, they should get the vote.
Absolutely.
So, and
I wish we did that today, where like if you don't pay taxes, you don't really get to vote.
I think there's a strong case for that.
I strongly believe that. I think if you're, not, because the incentive is so corrupt, it's so corrupted. But of course, you know what I mean? Like, you're just going to take the you're going to take if you're not you know what I mean?
Another George Bernard Shaw quote, the government promising to rob Peter to pay Paul and count on the support of Paul.
Of course. I mean, of course, who's not going to vote for that? I mean, it seems absurd.
So I think, 5 years of income tax or something like that.
That seems very fair. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, we don't let, children vote. We don't, you know what I mean? Like,
they want to bring in age 16. You can't smoke, but you can't smoke. You can't buy alcohol, but you can die as a soldier and vote.
But you can't cut off your genitalia now, right? You can do a sex change on you, apparently, right?
That's a whole different thing. But that's a lot of the time we're discovering that is funded by tax as well.
Yeah, insane.
Our greatest buildings.
Yeah.
We've, some of the greatest buildings in history, all our great municipal buildings were built with taxpayers' money.
Yeah.
I don't know which story of the pyramids you believe, but if they were built by aliens, or human slaves working for aliens, or they were built by the ancient Egyptians, one way or the other, there was tax money involved.
I think so.
The Great Wall of China you can see from outer space. People think the Great Wall of China was built to keep out the Mongol hordes. It wasn't. It was built to funnel people so that they could collect taxes along the Silk Road.
Makes sense.
It's built for both purposes. Hadrian's Wall was built for the same reason. Offa's Dyke, all these great walls, as well as keeping barbarians out, were to channel people in. They were tax collection points.
Get those duties, those tribes, those what did you call them? The word tasks. The word
tax didn't exist until the 13th century. They used to be called tasks, and your tax wouldn't always be paid in coin, because ordinary people weren't holding coin until after the Black Death. The richer people held coins, but so you would give a share of your produce or a share of your labor.
Yeah.
This is how taxes were paid, and they were often paid to the church. But then the definition between church, king, ruler, God, they were all a lot of crossover between them.
And then this idea of a censor, it seems like, when I think of this, it's like this idea of a censor, and then censorship. It's almost like an attack, a tax on your ideas, a tax on your freedom to speak.
Well, the word census, which as in the case with what Augustus levied, and censor, they all have the same roots. And the Roman censor was the magistrate in charge of keeping up the moral standings.
Yeah.
In other words, of policing speech and so on. But he was also tax collector. And so, there's crossover, and there's always this moral thing. Tax is your duty.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we're taxing tobacco because tobacco is bad, or we're taxing oil because oil is bad, climate change, whatever. There's always this moral...
That's the latest scam too. They're using the census because we in the United States, we apportion, I think it's like congressional seats based on the census, how many people, right? So what they're doing now is they're just saying, they're just counting everybody, not a citizen. That's why they're bringing all these people in, right? Because it's giving them more political power, even though these people are not citizens. It's kind of wild. And
probably have to pay, I don't think illegal immigrants or even, pay that much tax. They'll pay tax when they buy stuff, sales tax, but they won't pay income tax and so on.
Now I'm trying to get the other side of this to, steelman this whole thing. And the best explanation that I've heard so far from somebody that explained it to me was like that. And we were talking a little bit about this earlier, but now I just recalled the best argument that I've heard, which is yes, the people that come in the first generation, they take from the system. They don't give to the system. But the second and third generation gives more to the system than they take. That was the argument, the rationale. I mean, personally, I think even if that is true, I think there's something very unfair about forcing people of this generation to pay for, future to pay for future generations. It just not seems wild.
Yeah, the story I heard, the problem is with immigration is the role of welfare within immigration, and how much of immigration actually ends up being subsidized. So, for example, the immigration to America that occurred in the 19th century, that was people fleeing famine in Ireland and famine in Europe and seeking better. A lot of the motivation for the immigration was famine. But when they arrived in America, they might have had a little bit of help from other people.
Other people that were here. I mean,
there was no sort of top-down statute helping them out, and they were pretty much left to fend for themselves.
Absolutely.
And so, that resulted in this kind of entrepreneurial spirit that you have in the States. Whereas now, if for example, in the UK, illegal immigrants are sometimes housed in 5-star hotels while they're waiting for their thing to be paid. It's just
all of the expense of the taxpayer.
Yeah, and so it's the incentives are totally different.
Totally broken incentives.
But so and given benefits and so on, and then you go, well, you have to give these people benefits. It's immoral not to give them anything. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But in any case, the taxpayer ends up paying for it. So, but the story I heard, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but it takes 3 generations.
3 generations, yeah.
And the first generation come and get their head down and work, and it's the second generation who feel alienated because they don't feel part of the host nation, but they also don't feel part of the nation that they came from. And then by the third and fourth, you start to get assimilation. And if you look at a lot of the crimes that have been committed in the UK, terrorist, whatever, a lot of the time it's second generation. The people who don't feel part of the host nation. So this guy, Axel Radu Bobolov, whatever his name was. He's one example of second generation. And it's common. The guy who did the concert, what's the name? Something Grande concert in Manchester. There was a terrorist attack, and he was a second generation. And there was another one where a guy ran around a park in Reading stabbing gay people, and he was second generation. It's just really common. Yeah. Anyway, coming back to taxation,
there are massive costs to society from this, is what you're getting at, right?
Well, a lot of second generation, the alienated second generation, is a big problem. And you think how many people have come to the US and the UK in the last 10 or 20 years. That means 10 or 20, over the next 10 to 40 years, we got the second generation problem coming. Are governments putting preparations in place for how to deal with the second generation problem? Of course they're not. But it's like migration now. 8 billion people in the world, able to travel further and faster than ever before because of planes, trains, cars, whatever. They've all got a smartphone, so they're aware of better lives. 7 billion people on the world on less than $40 a day. You've got the desire to move. You've got the ability to move. You've got more people than ever before. You go, it's inevitable that people are going to move, whether it's planned or accidental. It's inevitably going to happen.
I think it's...
What preparations have you got in place?
Again, the main problem that I and so many have is that it's funded Like, it's not even like, hey, like Ellis Island, like figure it out, get here. You're an entrepreneur, you're on your own, but you have this great opportunity, right? The American dream, right? Because at the end of the day, that's really what it is, right? But instead, it's let's take $200 million from the taxpayers and then give it to some shady NGO. Apparently, we're finding out $200 million is going to some Lutheran church or whatever, and they're the ones who are facilitating with the cartels or whoever all this illegal immigration, and it's on the taxpayer dime. And then they get dropped off in some city of 3,000 people, and there's 5,000 immigrants just dropped there. The city's not prepared for that. They can't deal with that. It's not fair. It's not reasonable. And it's not even like those people just came. It's like, hey, they took our tax dollars, went to get those people, and brought them here all on our dime. And then who knows how much money is stolen from that whole equation? A massive amount.
And there's also the fact that if you import cheap labor from abroad, you increase the supply of labor, and so the cost of labor goes down, and so people at the bottom doing the bottom end jobs tend to get paid less. And so you have this widening gap between those at the bottom and those at the top,
which is even more exacerbated by the fact
right behind so much of the anger that's felt in the world at the moment. It's like the overlooked white working class, or it doesn't matter what color they are. But
we got that with all of the massive inflation from the money printing, right? Because the people who have capital, like myself, or assets, assets go up in price, but the people who are the poorest, who are already hurting the labor, it's like, hey, you got your $1,200 check, but guess what? Your rent doubled forever now, or it went up 50%, right? And that's like, they have to essentially spend everything that they make every month to get by. So now you're flooding more cheap labor into that market. It's just a recipe for further disaster.
Well, so much of this is to do with taxation, because tax is, as I said, it's power.
Yeah.
And it's because we are taxed so much, that is what enables government. And that is what enables government to grow as big as it has, particularly when it has the power to print money. So it has the power to spend money before it actually receives it.
It's unbelievable. I mean, the level of fraud that's occurring and what's being exposed right now is just absolutely breathtaking. I mean, we kind of all knew it was happening, but like, just to see the excess, the abuse, the fraud, the waste is just like, it makes your stomach roll over. It's like,
it does
crazy.
Indeed. But tax is the great enabler, and this is why we need to be talking about it.
Which takes us to that quote we talked about in the first episode, which is probably one of the most. You asked me, what's your biggest purchase you'll ever make, right? And you said the most expensive purchase is your government, right?
Yeah.
You work, I think you said 20 years of your life is dedicated to working for the government, right? So, which is essentially, you're a serf.
We'll come to that. We'll come to that in a second. So, but you're asking me why tax, and I'm just saying to you that tax is behind everything, and even the surnames we have because of tax. Until the 13th century, ordinary people did not have surnames. They'd just be John or William, whatever their name was. And this is in Western Europe. And then because of the Black Death, effectively wiping out serfdom and creating a shortage of supply of labor, serfs were suddenly paid for their labor because there was such a shortage of labor. They were handling money for the first time. So what did they do? They brought in poll taxes, where you're taxed by the head, and they made these laborers pay taxes. And in order to differentiate John, who was John's son, from John, who's got a crooked nose, from John, who lives by the hill, from John, who is a smith, you gave them all surnames. And when I say crooked nose, a lot of Gaelic names people were defined after defining characteristics. So Kennedy, I think, which is a very common Gaelic name, I think it means shaggy head, and Cameron means crooked nose, and so on. But Connolly, another common Gaelic name, means valiant. But we were given surnames for the purpose of distinguishing people, for the purpose of collecting taxes. So my surname Frisby, it just means I'm from the village Frisby, and Frisby just means village of the Frisian people.
I found out mine means new man.
What's your surname?
Novak. So it means
Novak.
It means new man. So I guess I was my ancestors were
you didn't take vaccines,
or some they were. Oh man.
Very good. And so leaders use taxation to control people, to shape behavior. We talked about the beard tax before, incentives, and tax tobacco. And often these incentives backfire. You tax tobacco because tobacco is bad for you. You cut down on tobacco consumption, but you also increase tobacco smuggling. And tax, with the government being the most expensive purchase you ever make in your life, when you ask people the number one reason why they don't have more children, the most commonly given reason is cost. I cannot afford to have more kids. And if you look at people who have big families, the tendency, not 100%, but the tendency is either the very rich who can afford to have more families, or the very poor who don't pay for them anyway. And the middle classes tend to have fewer kids. Well, if the government is the biggest expense you ever have in your life, and the reason you don't have more kids is because of cost, remove that cost and more people will have more kids.
No doubt.
So the number one reason, effectively, that people are having fewer kids is cost. Tax is the biggest cost of all. So, and then the government goes, oh, we haven't got enough workers, birth rate's too low, we need to bring in more people from abroad.
Yeah.
There you go. Tax is right at the bottom of it.
Fascinating.
Now, today, taxes are taken often by stealth. They're taken at source, and they're taken by force. You know, if you don't pay taxes, you go to jail. And in many cases, the option to go, I'm not paying taxes, isn't there because, as I say, they're deducted at source. And there's a great Chris Rock quote, you don't pay taxes, they take taxes.
Yeah.
You get the check, the money's already gone. That isn't a payment, it's a jack. Now, there are examples in society where taxes were voluntary. Amazing. Ancient Greece, liturgy, and we can talk about that.
Oh, yeah, let's save that a little bit.
But today, and like taxes are kind of a measure of freedom. So in an anarchy, and there's never been a proper anarchy, but in an anarchy, you have no taxes, no law, no government, nothing, and you own 100% of your labor. Whereas the guys in a totalitarian North Korean state, or the slave, has no ownership of his own labor, doesn't even own his own body, effectively. So that's kind of 100% taxation, and then 100% zero taxation. And the social democracies that we're in today, 40, 50% of, by the time you factor in inflation, it's a little bit more in Western Europe, it's a little bit less in the States. But the social democracies today, we're at around about half. Roughly, over the course of your life, roughly half of everything you ever take will go to government.
Yeah, I mean, when you calculate in property taxes and sales tax and all
and
these
inflation,
and inflation. Oh yeah,
the biggest of the
big
lot.
one.
And so, you know, the medieval serf had to give. He was tied to the land. He couldn't leave the land. But and the serf was the descendant of the Roman slave. But he would have to give half his working week to his lord. And the other half of his working week, he got to keep the produce himself. But then he'd have to take the mill to his lord's granary to be processed, and then he'd have to give a bit. So they carried on taking stuff off him even after everything. But, you know, I know life is a lot better today because of technology, and we're liberated because I can talk to anyone in the world on my phone and I can drive anywhere and blah, blah, blah. In that sense, we're freer and more liberated, more powerful, and life is a lot better. But in terms of the amount of time taken from us and the amount of our labor we actually own, our existence is no different to the medieval serf.
Wild.
And taxes permeate everything we do. There is not a single activity except there is not a single. I used to do a show where I talk about taxes, and I go to the audience, shout me out an activity that doesn't involve taxation, and see if you can shout out an activity that doesn't involve taxation. Can you think of one? Okay, so this is quite rude, and I apologize to your listeners. The one activity you get
Sex
is sex.
Yeah, that was what just came to my
I'm
mind.
going to say sex or murder.
Well, murder. Okay, no, murder is taxed because you go to jail and then you. But sex, the bed you do it on, is taxed. I once got a heckle masturbating, and then somebody else, an Australian guy, said, "Yeah, but tissues are taxed." So you might have to cut that out. But anyway,
No, we don't cut anything out here.
And you know, going to the bathroom. You know, bodily functions are like a vague area, but even going to the bathroom, you know, loos are taxed, and the water that you flush it is taxed, and so on. There used to be in ancient Rome, there was a tax on urine. They had urine taxes.
That was a wild one that you mentioned.
But people used to collect urine in these. You'd have these massive jugs at strategic points around the city, and people would collect urine. People would leave these jugs out, and then people would fill up the jugs with their urine, and then somebody would come and collect the urine, and they would use it for tanning and leathering, but also brushing your teeth.
That's disgusting.
It is disgusting. But different, like aristocratic urine was more prized than slaves' urine. And for some reason, I don't understand why, but for some reason, Portuguese urine was the most prized urine in Europe. Anyway, there's some stupid thing.
Wild.
So, yes. So as a result of all of this, as I say, the most expensive purchase you ever make in your life is government. And as I hope I've already explained, taxes, wars, conquests, religion, tax is behind everything. And then there's always this moral question.
Yeah, that's the last.
Is what if, like, I'm working this hard to, and half of what I work for is going to the government, and then the government are then using that money to spend on things that I don't agree with.
Yeah, that's the big one.
You know, I don't agree with going to war.
Yeah.
In such and such a place. I don't agree with the military industrial complex. I don't agree with sponsoring such and such US aid or whatever it is. Well, tough titty. We're taking your money, and that's
I'll tell you what,
using.
Dominic. I'm going to do it like which English king was this? We won't take your money for that, but guess what? I have a way out for you. I'm going to give you the cowardice tax. Is that okay? So you don't have to pay for the war. You just got to pay this cowardice tax.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
That was Henry II.
Henry,
and King John and Richard the Lionheart.
We'll touch that one in another
Spooky.
chapter. But that one made me laugh. That was the best one I've heard so far.
But those are the words. Now,
yeah.
We say that tax is the price you pay for a civilized society. And
Yeah.
that's the Wendell. What was his name? Wendell.
The
something.
IRS guy.
And that's in the written into the brick
Mhm.
on the outside of the IRS building, and that is the accepted thing. Taxes are the price. But is that civilized? Forced labor, but you know what I mean, for something you don't agree with.
Yeah. Which
And
brings us to that 10% number that we talked about, right? The income tax of 10%, the alms, the tithe, whatever it means. One finger out of 10. I mean, that seems to be like
that's
the way.
a good number.
You could pluck a couple feathers off me and I won't hiss. That would be like reasonable. Right?
If I go to Bitcoin conferences,
Yeah.
I leave like a massive ANCAP. I walk away and I'm like, we don't need any government. We don't need government. Or we can have, citadels and subscription taxes, and you pay your money and you get something back directly, and much more accountability. And that's a much better design for the future.
Yeah.
And indeed, one of the problems that we have today is that our tax systems are designed around physical economies. They're designed around the Industrial Revolution and the post-Industrial Revolution nations, and they're not fit for purpose today. They're and they're going to have to be reformed, or they're going to have to die a death. Or if they're not reformed and they die a death, the countries as we know them will die a death. But you cannot have government without taxation. So the ANCAT will say no taxation, no government, idyllic society. But the reality, the evidence of history is there have been voluntary taxes, but there's never been a society without some kind of organizing force at the top, which has to be paid for somehow. And so, that is an issue, and I'm sure these modern societies will develop where they'll find clever ways of doing it and voluntary ways of doing it. And if city-states were left to themselves, if people could, it's very difficult to set up a nation. These guys who've got that place on the border with Slovenia, what is it called? Liberland.
Liberland, yeah. I'm a
citizen.
I'm a digital e-resident or something.
I think I might be a citizen.
I got my little card. You have your ID?
But I think so. At some point, I put money in. I think at some point, then I might be worried that I was on the wrong list or something like that. But the reality is, though, that like if you want to go to a party in Liberland, the party's offshore. It doesn't actually happen in Liberland; it happens somewhere else. And so Liberland is this great idea. But if you actually look at what's going on the ground, it's in the mind. It's not on the ground.
Yeah, it's
and so
they're trying to build in Homestead. I get all these emails. I'm trying to figure it out.
Yeah, but they need to get recognition from the United Nations.
Yeah.
This and it just never happened.
Did you dive into the whole story of that? I guess.
No, I met him. The guy runs
really?
At this thing called what's it called? There's an anarchy conference in Acapulco, and I met him at that. I met him and David Icke, one of the best days of my life. And his presentation was like the funniest presentation I've ever heard by anyone. And he's got this sort of slightly Germanic accent. I think he's actually Czech or
Yeah,
Slovak.
Czech.
Or something.
Vit
But
Jedlica.
his opening line was, "We are going to build the greatest tax haven the world has ever seen." I was just pissing myself and laughed. It was so funny.
So, do you actually know the story? I did a lot of research on it because I was so curious.
Okay.
But basically, there was the war between the Serbia and Hungary, or
Yeah.
some kind.
Wasn't it the Yugoslav War?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not super familiar with the history over there of all that. So I'm on the other side of the pond. So
Yeah. Okay.
this is like probably is about as shaky as you are with the States and all the stuff happening here. But basically, there's this little island in the middle of this river, and after the war, they agreed that somebody would take this side of the river, and then somebody would take this side of the river. But what they didn't account for is in the middle of the river, there's this little land strip. So they looked over the documents, and basically it's unclaimed territory, essentially. It's not technically owned by the border of any nation. So this guy, Vit Jedlica, I think is his name, Jedlica. That's it, yeah.
Yeah.
So he basically went there and tried to set this all up and settle it, essentially. I know they were once, I think it was it Croatia, maybe trying to stop people from going there or something like that, acting like they had jurisdiction. But according to the border agreements post the war, it's technically no man's land, which is the argument that he's making.
Mhm.
So it is fascinating, right? So he's
The problem is access.
yeah, you have to go through,
Yeah.
Croatia or wherever to get access to it. Yeah.
Yeah. I look at this because I love the river, just the River Thames in London,
Mhm.
and there's always this unused land on
Mhm.
the river, but it's
Yeah.
not the land, it's the river itself. But you can't get
Mhm.
to the river.
Yeah.
You need the access points.
It's fascinating, but it is a cool story. I mean, maybe
It's great. And I hope
yeah.
it works.
I hope it works too. I mean, I threw a little money into the pot to try to move it along. I have to.
But the problem is getting recognition from everyone else. But,
yeah,
but
which is what he was trying to do. I think he was going to. I get all these emails that say, "Hey, we met with the
maybe
ambassador of Hong Kong, and we met with the ambassador of this country or whatever." So
this might be one of those things that Trump just says just to sort of change the Overton window. But he was talking last week about rehoming all the Palestinians and finding some land somewhere else. And then he said Saudi Arabia's got plenty of land. We could rehouse them in Saudi Arabia. But, there's no shortage of land across North Africa. And there's plenty of, and particularly if you can find technical ways of getting water there, the main issue is water. But if
we could probably
that
spend
were
30
to
hours
happen,
just talking about that.
Well, yeah,
That's a
and
wild rabbit hole.
Yeah, and don't let's go there. But just for the purpose of this, let's just say that Palestinians could be rehomed somewhere else, and Trump was able to buy a plot of real estate somewhere that's similar size to the Gaza Strip and give that to Palestinians and say that's your home now. Well, that would set the precedent of buying land from nations and creating other nations with it, and so new nations can start up. And then what can happen?
I think that's a pretty awesome precedent. If it gets
amazing,
amazing. That's a great precedent.
Because
Instead of war,
then,
it's
and then
it's
people
transaction.
buy
It's voluntary.
Yeah, and I mean, the most of America was bought as a real estate deal. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, I think, the greatest real estate deal in history, closely followed by Alaska. America was founded on two extraordinary real estate deals, and so and that's how Trump thinks in terms of real estate.
He's a great real estate. Despite all the things you can say about the guy, he's great with real estate.
He is
his superpower.
And so, but let's just say a large plot of Chad, or one of somewhere, I don't even know, Mauritania or somewhere. There's a land.
We're giving them all of our tax money anyway. Might as well get something.
Well, but then you start forming new nations, and then you get into a world where new nations form and they have competitive new tax systems, and that you'd like to think that the best tax systems will be the most thriving countries, and then everything follows there. So it's exciting possibilities, but. As I say, without taxation, there can be no government. And so many of the problems that we face today, not least the inequality gap, all derive from problems in the tax system, whether it's fiat money, income tax. Income tax penalizes the young because all the young have is their labor. And we tax them heavily, and then we pay them in money that loses its purchasing power.
Yeah.
We don't tax capital or assets to anything like the same extent. And then people wonder why and the old are all asset rich, and we wonder why there's such a big gap in between the young and the old. We'll look no further than income tax. And then the young delay having families because they can't afford to.
Yeah, the incentive.
And then you have mass migration. It's just
You hit the nail on the head.
Starts with tax.
Yeah.
Everything. And all these problems, tax is patient zero. In the zombie film, you have this idea of patient zero where the virus started. And if the hero of the zombie film can get to patient zero and either kill patient zero or patient zero's got the antidote, whatever, tax is patient zero. You fix tax and everything follows from there. And I keep coming back to it. I'm so excited. Like Elon Musk follows me on Twitter, but I think he follows me for my comic songs, not for my economic wisdom. But I'm just desperate.
We're gonna have to get his attention to watch this.
Yeah, just wish he'd read this book.
Yeah,
because they're going. I mean, they're going to audit the IRS next, but they'll hopefully persuade them that, oh my God, if we get the tax system right, then none of this can happen again.
You're so right, and this is why we're. I mean,
and Trump's talked about bringing in tariffs and replacing income tax with them. And initially, income tax replaced tariffs in 1913. Yeah. So, if it can happen, you can design a fantastic country. And funnily enough, one of the reasons America's worked so well is because you have competing states within the US competing.
The idea of federalism,
Yeah, and so that was, so that kind of keeps a rein on the federal thing. It's got out of control in the last 20 or 30 years, but it's
really out of control, man. It's
not as bad as Western Europe.
Yeah.
So, so that's why tax.
That's why tax, which takes us to our next segment here about the cradle of taxation. So, this Sumerian proverb, right? If you go back to ancient Sumer, even like 7,000 years, 7,000 BC or whatever, 7,000 years ago. It's when was Sumer? Was it 4,000 BC?
Well,
it was about 7,000 years ago.
7 to 10,000 years ago is when human beings are supposed to have settled for the first time. But I've recently been reading about the Anunnaki of Sibiru. Have you heard of the Anunnaki?
I've heard a little bit. What about Goebli Tepe? Is it Goebli Tepe? Have you heard of that one?
No.
That's hunter-gatherer civilization, apparently, where they had these huge stones. Pull that up, Paul. Goebli Tepe. I think it's Goebli and then Tekki. Could be wrong on the spelling, but I think that's what it is.
Well, the Anunnaki of Sibiru predate them
too. Let's see.
So the Anunnaki of Sibiru were aliens. My daughter put me onto these. Aliens who were from some planet in outer space, and they needed gold to hang in their atmosphere to reflect the sun. Because they had problems with stars or something. And they came to planet Earth because there was loads of gold on planet Earth. And the ancient hominids they found on planet Earth, they were going to enslave to get them mining the gold for them. Except the ancient hominids were just really shit. They're really thick and which is incapable of being good enough to mine the gold for them. So they mated with them, or they crossed their DNA with them somehow.
I've heard this.
This
is how
story.
Homo
sapiens.
Okay, I've heard. Okay, now that it's ringing a bell, was this on like Rogan or something? I heard. It's a wild thing, but apparently there was some like.
Well, the guy who's wrote it, I forget his name, but he's supposed to have interpreted ancient Sumerian text. And these Anunnaki left, thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. But they left their myth, they left their legend. They came down and they built. The pyramids, for example, Stonehenge. Pyramids, the caps of pyramids were once supposed to have been coated in gold to reflect, celestial, blah, blah, blah. And so, anyway, so maybe human beings weren't hunter-gatherers who eventually settled. Maybe it was an Anunnaki thing. Or maybe you take the conventional view that, we were hunter-gatherers who eventually settled in the fertile plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates.
We definitely that definitely happened. There's like archaeological evidence of that. So
and this the flood legend is common to every
that's
everything.
Wow.
And if you look at I love looking at the states because and particularly I've just come from Palm Springs, and so you've got all these mountains and then Palm Springs and this land which is just completely flat, and you just know that at one point in history that everything that's flat in the middle of America was just underwater at some point in history, and we lived on the mountains.
Yeah,
the seas went out, so sea levels were once much higher, and that's why America's just so incredibly flat. Where it's not mountainous, it's just flat. And the UK is not like that. It's much more, up and down. And so flat was just, in my opinion, was the seabed. But anyway, so I think the seas might have receded. And that's what enabled human beings to come down from the mountains into the plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And they found mud there, and they used the mud to make tools, and they baked it with straw, and they found it made bricks, and the bricks built the first cities, and the mud, they could grow stuff in the mud, and it was incredibly fertile, and they didn't have to keep moving to find food. They could grow food, and so human beings began to settle. And then they used the mud as money.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
So you'd have little tokens, and it's kind of like tokenized coins in a funny kind of way. But you'd have, a cone would be a bit of barley, and a disc would be a sheep, and you'd bake the cones inside these clay balls, and then when the debt was settled, you'd smash open the clay ball. And then over time, they found actually it was quicker to, instead of doing all that, just to inscribe the clay with pictures of the things instead. And so did the first hieroglyphics start, the first system of writing. Well, what were the most commonly debts that were owed? Taxes. So, our systems of writing came from taxes.
Tax, yeah. That's this quote that I love, because even 8,000 years ago, or however long it goes, you can have a god and a king, but the man to fear is the tax collector.
Yeah.
Even in ancient Sumer.
An ancient Sumerian proverb.
And I found Gobekli. I butchered the name of it, but it's Gobekli Tepe. Gobekli Tepe, the dawn of civilization. So, situated in southeastern Turkey near the border with Syria, the structures of Gobekli Tepe date back to approximately 9,500 to 8,000 BCE, making them some of the oldest known monumental architecture in the world, predating Stonehenge by about 6,000 years and the Egyptian pyramids by more than 7,000 years.
Wow.
So this is even an older civilization. So fascinating. And maybe before there was writing.
So 9,500 BC would be 11,500 years ago.
Almost 12,000 years ago, yeah. So it looks like they had a lot of intricate carvings of animals, humans, abstract motifs. These included foxes, lions, birds, snakes. So there's a lot of symbolism and some
Nazca lines are another one like that. But,
fascinating.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. But in any case, the birthplace of civilization was the birthplace of taxation. But taxation existed in hunter-gatherer societies, sense of duty to the collective. And there's a great story from ancient Sumer. So there was this war between two of the kingdoms, Umma and Lagash, over disputed water reserves. And so the king of Lagash, he won the war. And so he got the water reserves, but he carried on levying taxes against his people even after the war had finished. Ever heard that before?
It's
Revenue
crazy.
Act of 1942.
It's crazy how history just repeats itself. Those who don't know their history just repeat it, right?
And so, and this is interesting, by the way, the scribes were the first people who mastered this new skill of handwriting. The scribes, they were the tax collectors. And but one scribe wrote, from one end of Lagash to the other, there was the tax collector. And if a man separated from his wife, he had to pay silver. If a shepherd sheared his sheep, he had to pay 5 shekels of silver. If a husband died, the widow had to pay silver from their inheritance tax, early inheritance tax. The boatman appropriated boats. The livestock official appropriated asses and sheep. The fisheries inspector appropriated fish. It just went on and on and on, until eventually one of history's first tax reformers, Urakajina, the ancient Sumerian Elon Musk, replaced the conventions of former times, and he fired the collectors, he cut the taxes, he exempted widows from inheritance, and he protected citizens from unscrupulous taxation. It is exactly the same thing.
It's fascinating.
That's happening
You
now.
study history, it just, you can watch it repeat and repeat and repeat.
Yeah, this still doesn't mean there's anything you can do about it. You still need someone like Donald Trump and Elon Musk to come out.
Well, I really do believe, and I think that's just why a lot of us, at least myself, why we're involved in Web3 and in blockchain and a lot of these things, that it really, the reason that they're able to do so much of this, of taking from people, is because they're able to physically do it, right? But when, you're able to have all of your wealth stored in a password in your brain, you know what I mean? It's like, how are they going to take that from you, right? So it really gives you true ownership in the next digital realm, right? And the next realm of technology and advancement is largely digital. So this idea of being able to have that true ownership is part of the reason why Bitcoin is so appealing, right? So if people pay tax in the next 100 years, I truly believe it's going to be a voluntary contribution, much less than a forced physical taking of that funds, right? There's going to be real accountability there. I'm not going to fund a $2 million missile to go to knock out that balloon out of the sky with my tax dollars, going forward. If we were able to reform this and get to I'm trying to think of the word, right? It's almost like they use it to say that you have a contract. It's almost like the social contract, right? If we're able to fix this contract, the social contract that we all have with one another as a civilization, as humanity, right? It needs to be based on, just like Hong Kong, right? The voluntary.
Sure. The beauty of Bitcoin is that it is a financial system that is independent. It is apolitical. No government has control over it. And they can control at the edges, the margins, they can control the exchanges and so on. If you want your company to be incorporated, then you have to deduct, and you pay all your staff in Bitcoin, well, you have to deduct this amount and pay that in taxes and convert it into, so there are ways that they can control it. But it is a much harder system to regulate and control than fiat money and fiat banking.
Yeah,
and so it reduces the power of government. And by embracing Bitcoin, it gives you a peaceful exit.
Exactly.
You don't have to rise up and revolt. You can just go, no, I'm just going to use this one.
I love that. I think you hit the nail on the head, right? It
is also immune to the inflation tax.
Yeah, it's immune to, humanity making poor decisions, which we do, especially when you're in power and you don't have to suffer the consequences. So you're putting your trust in a mathematical, fair system that everybody is completely transparent. Everybody knows how it works. You can't manipulate it. You can't gaslight. You can't do all this stuff.
And you spend your money better than they do.
Absolutely.
The idea that were there no taxes, that there would be no government services. I did say without taxation you can't have government, but I also believe that charity, helping your fellow man, is a basic human instinct. And charity starts at home. The first people you want to protect are your immediate family, your parents, your kids, then your cousins and so on. And then from there it goes to your friends. And then from there it goes to your community and so on. And if you didn't have 50% of everything you ever earned taken from you, you would be in a much stronger position to do that.
Yeah.
And so by taxing people so heavily, you are actually attacking the power of the family. By taxing people heavily and going, we're going to provide healthcare, we're going to do this, we're going to build the roads, you are eroding the responsibility
of the individual,
of the family, and the individual to the family. And in eroding that responsibility, you erode its freedom and you erode its power.
I always love the quote, it's the way I feel. It's like, I'm communist with my family, I'm socialist with my friends, and I'm capitalist with the rest of society who I don't know. You know what I mean? I think that's a good model to live by.
Who came up with that?
Was that Nassim?
I think so. But yeah, it's lovely. Or he might have quoted it.
How's he doing these days?
I haven't followed him. It's amazing that you can have somebody who writes such brilliant books full of such profound wisdom be so badly wrong about Bitcoin.
Oh, man. I think it's more of a personal vendetta to him.
I think so. I think he just got really badly trolled.
Or something like that. He got trolled and he just
he just
couldn't separate. Yeah, he just couldn't separate his emotions from his intellect, is the way it seems.
Maybe. It's bad. Elon got heavily trolled by Bitcoiners. Yeah. And I wonder if he'd be a bit more outwardly probe. I mean, he still owns a lot. I get messages from people all the time telling me Elon's Satoshi, and he's certainly got the intellect. He's one of the few people that's got the intellect and competence to have been Satoshi.
But you and I both know he's not Satoshi.
No, he's not.
Yeah, you watch his evolution of understanding how Bitcoin works and how things go over time, and you just
he's a brilliant man.
Yeah,
one of the greatest individuals alive today, but he's not Satoshi. Even he'd admit that.
Yeah. I think you, me, and him have come to the same conclusion.
But so the earliest form of taxes, I suppose, was the tithe. And we talked about it 1/10. And it's an easy number to calculate. That's why we think in decimals is good, because of the 10 fingers. And the tithe is common to every religious culture. It's, what was it called? Dawanda in Sikh. And in Buddhism, almsgiving is where the journey to nirvana begins. In Hinduism, dana. Charity is common to every religion, and this need to help our family is just, it's a basic human need. So the idea that if government didn't force it on us, it wouldn't happen is mistaken. It would happen, but by other means. And as we've talked about voluntary taxes and all the rest of it, there are better means for it to happen. but it is just not possible while these legacy systems are still in place.
Ezretu, that's what the Sumerians called it.
Isretu. Yeah.
Ezretu. I like that was a
I've forgotten
one.
that. It's good having somebody who knows my book better than I do. But and unfortunately, it was big Western government kind of killed the tithe because you would give the tithe to your church, but as after the Industrial Revolution and people moved from the land to the cities, tithing kind of fell away, and then you paid the government, and then it just sort of died with time.
Yeah,
basically.
You mentioned something interesting in your book that I can't really relate to because I'm not from the other side of the pond, but you said like the NHS, which is the National Health Service, it was like it almost became like a religious thing for people.
The state in the UK, and to an extent in the States, but you know, Polly Toynbee is a big left-wing commentator. She writes for The Guardian. You know, she's a real kind of dame of the left. The Guardian would be our equivalent.
I don't know.
She doesn't need the money. She's got plenty of money. She's fine. You don't need to worry about it.
I'm kidding.
I think she comes from a rich family, but in any case, you know, the Guardian would be like the New York Times or something. And then you got Nigel Lawson, who was like the great tax-cutting right-wing guy. They both, at different times in their writing, referred to the NHS as the new British religion. Christianity sort of, you know, faded away in Britain, sadly, in my view, but it has. And it happened as the state, after the World War I and then World War II, the welfare state, the growth of the state, the National Insurance Acts and so on, the government began to take responsibility for education, healthcare, welfare, and so on. Duties traditionally taken up by the church. And as the government replaced the church, the responsibility of the church faded away and the power of the church faded away. It's amazing how responsibility and duty creates power. It's odd. You know, people think, oh, I don't want responsibilities. Have the responsibilities because it will make you powerful. But in any case, the state now provides these things. And so there's a large portion of people that now worship the state. They don't realize they worship. They don't go on their knees and pray to it, but they're the fervence and irrational passion that, for example, defense of the NHS.
Over there.
Yeah.
You know.
And you see it on the left over here, you know, the defense of whatever is, you know, why are you so angry about some of the stuff's being exposed by US aid? It's because your belief system is being undermined and challenged.
Yeah.
And,
it's cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, there's this crossover between politics and religion. Yeah. Your belief system is being undermined and exposed, and that is what you don't like. That's what's happening. People don't like it. But in any case, the NHS is our stupid god, but it's the new god.
It's the new god. Wow.
Ancient Greece. We have many things to thank the ancient Greeks for, but they demonstrated that taxation can be voluntary.
I love this.
And they had a system called liturgy. And there was a commissioner of the Internal Revenue called Donald Alexander, and he said, we do not have and have never had and could not have a voluntary tax system. Well, history says otherwise. It didn't last. Nothing does. But it was there. It was there for a bit. And ancient Greece in its heyday, when it had Aristotle and, you know, all the rest of it, was based on a voluntary tax system. And this idea of giving was sort of embedded in the Greek psyche, and part, you know, Athena gave the olive tree, Prometheus gave mankind the gift of, you know, benefaction. I mean, benefaction is sort of intrinsic to most civilizations in one form or another. And Aristotle had this idea of the magnificent man, and a poor man could not be magnificent. This is very interesting because they did not have the financial means to be magnificent. Whereas a rich man, you know, and had the ability to do greater good with his wealth. Yeah. And so that meant he was more able to be magnificent. Hippocrates, you know, you said that people come to the hospitals in the US and they get their health care and then they walk away and they don't pay the bill. Yeah. this idea of you help someone who needs it goes all the way back to Hippocrates, and
That's-
probably predates him, although he's given the credit.
I have in my notes here to actually ask you about this because it's the Hippocratic oath that the doctors take, which it actually says to do no harm. So I'm wondering if this is the same Hippocrates.
It's the same Hippocrates, but it's a different
Different
he's
field.
the father of
It's a
medicine.
little.
Sometimes give your services for nothing, calling to mind a previous benefaction or present satisfaction. And if there be an opportunity of serving one who is a stranger in financial straits, give full assistance to all such. One of the lesser known Hippocratic proclamations.
I love it.
But,
I love it.
So let's say an ancient Greek city needed, a new road or a new bridge or a new warship, to defend the shipping lanes from pirates, or it needed a festival of a drama or some games, a Super Bowl, whatever. Then the responsibility fell on the rich citizen to provide this service. And the result was that because the rich citizen would gain great prestige by putting on this event, he would end up spending more than he was expected to.
Reputation was on the line.
His reputation was. He would also have to carry out the work himself. So it wouldn't be left to some bureaucrat to spend his money for him. He would have to do it. And didn't we say you spend your money better than other people
Absolutely.
do? And your reputation would get better and your standing would get better. And so, and it actually reached the point where initially only Greek warriors could achieve heroic status, but eventually liturgists could achieve heroic status. And Pericles, the famous Greek, he was he established his reputation putting on plays. And the Panathenaic Games, for example, these were all liturgic festivals. And of course it was exploited for personal gain. You put your reputation on the line.
But it benefited everybody.
But
it benefited the citizens. I mean,
and if you get a good reputation out of it, I'm sure some people wangled it, so they even made some money out of it at some point.
Yeah.
But it's so similar to what Elon Musk is doing.
That's literally in my notes.
Donald
You
Trump
took it there. I was going to take it there.
I keep coming back to it, but Donald Trump is going. He's not being paid to do this.
We're literally living through this right now. We're living through this right now. I mean, this is literally what's happening with Doge.
He's just doing it because he knows it's going to make the world better.
It's a public service to humanity.
Yeah. And he's got more FU money than anyone else in the world, and he literally does not care what anyone thinks of him.
I love it.
He has zero tolerance for it. You're either with me or you.
That's literally exactly what it is.
Does not care who he has a go at.
I'm so glad he took it there because that was in my notes, and that was like, I was going to say we're actually living through some of that right now, which is fascinating to see.
And so. And sometimes you would have competition. So Pericles would put on some games and then Simon would go, I'm going to put on a better games. And he would put on a better games. And so the people benefited from the competition because these two guys got their vanity projects.
Yeah, they're, a dick swinging competition. And, who's going to put on the better, who's going to give back more to the community, right? I love it. I mean, that's the way it should be.
And if you didn't participate,
you were shamed.
You risked public. So we have this culture now of paying as little tax as possible.
Yeah.
Putting your assets in a company, because... And that's part of the problem with taxation is you get no thanks.
Yeah, and you
get no gratitude.
You're actually criminalized. You're considered the bad guy.
Yeah,
which is insane.
This is one of the reasons why we need charity. It is a basic human function.
Yeah,
and you want to give people, but you also want some recognition for your giving.
Of course.
Some people don't. Some people are happy to do it anonymously, but most people, they want to give, but they also want the fact that they've been giving recognized.
Yeah.
And you do not get that through the tax system. It's one of its limitations.
You hit the nail on the head. And that, brings to, it's like, why do high net worth people avoid, that is exactly what you just said.
Why do so many people join the army in America? Because everywhere you go, people go, thank you for your service.
Yeah.
People are so grateful to you.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why people serve. And
people just want to be appreciated. I mean, it's just what it is.
Yeah. And it's just basic human nature. But in any case, if you didn't want to participate, you could risk public scorn, or maybe you felt that you shouldn't have to pay. And so you could do this thing called antidosis. And you could say that, I don't think I should be paying this particular liturgy, actually. Matt, I think you should be paying it. And then you'd go, well, no, I don't think I should be paying it. And so we would then you would have three choices. You would either have to accept the liturgy, or you would have to submit to a trial in which a jury determined who was the wealthiest of the two of us. Or option three is we would swap assets.
I love that.
So
one.
you're looking at me, and even if you say you're worth less than me, you're looking at me going, what's his house like? What's his car like? I'm looking at you going, what's his house like?
Yeah, let's do the swap.
Yeah, and we're going, do we do the swap? Do we not do the swap?
Do the wives come with it or what?
Yeah, well, I guess in ancient Greece, you got the wife thrown in. So send me a picture and then I'll decide. But anyway, this all died with the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah.
And, the costs of the war and the war with Sparta, and eventually drained, it was the beginning of the end of the magnificence of ancient Greece. And Athens followed the pattern of many great societies, is the low taxes and freedoms that underpin them in their early days fade as the society evolves and the government obligations grow, especially because of war, and eventually end. But I keep coming back to the US today. It's just amazing, because most societies would have reached, how many documentaries have you watched about the cycle of empires?
Yes.
And we're at the end of an empire and the rise of China and blah, blah, blah. And, what is happening now is huge, and it is giving America a whole new lease of life.
You got to give the founding fathers of our nation credit for that, because they looked at history and designed the system in a way that was meant to protect from all of the stuff that's happened, right?
Yeah.
So
it would have done
our
if you'd
system
stuck
is
with
set.
gold and silver.
It actually, if I remember correctly, this whole idea of printing money and doing all this stuff, when our nation was originally founded, that was like a crime. You could be hanged for what they got away with.
Yeah,
because which is now actively encouraged by government policy. They knew
in the American Revolution, we printed loads of counterfeit money, and it was one of the ways we attacked you. We destroyed your money, and that's where you get the expression "not worth a continental" from. Is because your money lost all its purchasing power, and it was a huge problem for Alexander Hamilton when he designed the new currency, and that's why he said nothing but gold and silver.
Yeah,
and I think there's something in your original constitution about income tax as well. I've got a little. I'll have to remember that in time for the next episode.
We'll get there.
I think income tax is not constitutional.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I think they get away with everything.
But so that's taxation in ancient civilization, and that's why taxation. Those who accept Muhammad's religion and pray his prayers would be relieved of taxes.
That's a nice conversion strategy.
Absolutely. One of the most effective in history. So convert to Islam, you don't have to pay tax.
Yeah. Where do I sign? Allahu Akbar.
I think I'd do the same.
Amen, baby.
Many of us would. And so the conquered people were given, these were Zoroastrians. They were made to pay a poll tax known as jizya. But again, those who converted to Islam were exempted from it. And even those who did not convert were not badly treated as long as they paid up. But if you failed to pay up, you were either enslaved or killed. So you were given a choice: death, taxes, or Islam. And of course, many chose Islam.
Welcome back to another episode of Cypherpunked. We're here for our third episode in the series about Daylight Robbery, and I'm here with my buddy, Dominic Frisby.
Hello, sir. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So today, we're going to talk about Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and tax. And I know we kind of talked about it a little bit in some previous episodes, but we're going to double click and go deep into down those rabbit holes today.
Sure. And we talked about how you design a society the way you tax it, and how the destiny of a society is determined by the way it's taxed. And we also talked about how old taxation is, older than civilization itself, and that tax is power and tax is a form of rule. And how there is also a tax story behind pretty much everything, often an untold one. And so I'll do a little game with you, Matty. Just before we talk about religion, and there's a tax story behind every religion. And because religion was a form of control, a form of guidance, a form of
Coordination.
It was the media before we had media. You know, if eating pigs is bad for your health, well, make it a sin. And that's a good way to get the word out that you shouldn't eat pigs, or whatever that you shouldn't kill people and that you shouldn't steal and so on. So religion was, in a funny kind of way, prayer has been replaced by mass media. And I think I read a book about habits a few years ago, not Atomic Habits, it was another one, and willpower. And the author argued that religious people tend to be more successful than non-religious people. And he attributed that to habits. And those habits are often because if you're religious, you're often part of a religious community, and there's a lot of monitoring going on, and you feel you owe that community, and so you have an obligation to behave responsibly and behave in a good way. And if you behave according to these patterns, you tend to achieve more. And so anyway, the question I want to ask you, I'll just play a little game with you, but this idea that there's a tax story behind every great event in history, just off the top of your head, give me shout out an event from history, and I'll attempt to tell you the tax story.
The World War One.
Okay, well, every war in history was paid for by some kind of tax, and so that's war. Tax enables war, and that will do for that one.
Yeah, I think the world wars are near and dear to our hearts as Bitcoiners, which if you really look at the underlying incentives and stuff around all that.
Absolutely, and it was the beginning of the end of Britain as an international. I mean, the speed at which Britain, like the peak of the British Empire, was probably about 1911, something like that, a couple of years before World War One, and we really were, the greatest nation on earth. And the speed at which we have vacated that position is something to behold.
Yeah.
Go on, give us another one.
Another one. Let's do. Trying to think here.
The Titanic.
The Titanic. That's an interesting one. I don't know if
the sinking of the Titanic. That is a wild one. And I'd like to say that the Titanic was built with taxpayers' money, but I don't think it was. And I think that is a rare. I mean, it was going from one nation to another, but I think that is a rare occurrence that doesn't involve taxation. And in fact, the one kind of category that doesn't involve taxation is natural disasters. And you could say that the sinking of the Titanic, because it went into an iceberg, was a kind of a natural disaster. And you might say the tsunami in Indonesia, the famous tsunami shortly after the turn of the century, 2005, 2006, whenever it was. That was a natural disaster. The hurricane that took out South Carolina late last year, natural disaster. Where the tax story comes in, the plague, the Black Death, another natural disaster. Where the tax story comes in is in the rebuilding effort afterwards. And normally that involves a huge amount of taxpayers' money. And I don't actually know about who paid for the rescue effort of the Titanic, but I imagine it was the taxpayer. I'm as sure as
Let's find out
that the rescue effort was the taxpayer.
Let's chime in Grok here. Let's see if
I don't even know if Grok's going to know, because all Grok does, all the
just ask
AIs, they trawl the internet, and you find these questions are not readily available on the internet. A lot of the time you have to deduce, and this is why tax is such an important thing. Is the who paid for this in 1863? It's just not recorded. You just have to sort of deduce it, and that's an example of how this is an untold story.
Okay, so
but natural disasters, it's the rebuilding effort afterwards. The Great Fire of London one theory is that it came from people dodging their half tax.
Yeah, this
that
is
they
what I
knocked
wanted to
through.
talk about. Yeah,
you would knock through to the fire next door and use their chimney, and it's thought, and that did lead to fires. But
Really?
the Great Fire of London. But let's just assume it was an accident in a baker's. But the London was rebuilt on the proceeds of a coal tax imposed by Charles II afterwards, and so that's where that's the tax angle in natural disasters.
Fascinating. It looks like with the Titanic, there was like it was an international water, so there was ships that responded to the emergency call. But I think I did see there, although most of the funds weren't from taxpayers, there was like organizations and things set up that involved some public resources to help the families or help people.
Absolutely, and some of those ships that came would have been national ships, and some of them would have been privately. But the majority of that rebuilding, they would have sought some compensation, and there would have been a huge taxpayer spend at some stage in the salvaging and the life saving. So let's start with this idea that there's a tax story behind every great religion. And here's a question for you that I like. We noticed that the original handwriting came about as a result of a way of recording debts owed, which the majority of which were taxes. And so the people who mastered this new art of writing, the scribes, would become the tax collectors. But of the plethora of religions that existed in the Middle East, several hundred years before Christ or thousands of years before Christ, and in North Africa, there were hundreds of religions. Why did Judaism survive and none of the others?
That's a great question.
Is it because the Jews were the chosen people?
I think their story definitely survived the test of time.
That's their angle on it. The reason is they wrote theirs down.
They wrote it down, yeah.
And
speaking of which, what we didn't talk about last chapter, which was the Rosetta Stone.
Sure.
We didn't touch on that, so
we'll talk about the Rosetta Stone. We can talk about that in a sec. And then you wonder why Christianity replaced all the pagan religions and the Celtic religions of Northern Europe as Christianity spread north in the Dark Ages. And again, it's because all those pagan religions were passed on orally, and Christianity was written down. And it's one of the reasons that Christianity replaced all the religions in South America and across Africa largely as well. The Christianity was written down. And we've already discussed this relationship between handwriting and taxation.
The Christians were smart. I mean, they adopted a lot of the pagan holidays.
They did.
Built it into the whole story. I mean, that was fascinating.
Christmas.
Like Christmas, for example.
Midwinter solstice.
Like the winter solstice of the pagans. And they just say, oh, this is Jesus' birthday or whatever.
Absolutely. But it's, it's a tactic that's worked many times through history and will continue to work. So but the most famous incidents of Jewish people writing down their religion came with Moses and the Ten Commandments. And by about 1300 BC, the Jewish people had been in Egypt for, several hundred years, 400 or 500 years. But their growing wealth, their prosperity created a certain amount of resentment. They were reproducing. They were seen as a threat. And the Egyptians, to use the words of the Bible, became ill-affected towards the Hebrews. And Titus Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, said that they were touched with envy at their prosperity.
Sounds familiar.
A Hebrew historian. And the words of the Bible, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. That's what the Pharaoh said. Let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And so to deal wisely with them was to tax them. And there's a chap called Heinrich Gretz who wrote The History of the Jews, and he explains that at that time, you could only be enslaved if you were a prisoner of war or a criminal, or if you had failed to pay your debts or taxes. And so the oppression began with taxation. And this is not the first time in Jewish history that this has happened. It's how the Nazis began the persecution of the Jewish people as well. And in fact, not just the Jewish people, but persecution of any people often starts through the tax system.
Yeah.
And taxes were increased to punitive levels, and to use the words of the Bible again, as the Egyptians set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And it was escalated. And it made the children of Israel serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. And by the time that Moses led them out of Egypt, the once free Hebrews had become slaves. Slavery, which you have no ownership of your labor, your entire self, it's the ultimate form of taxation. And so Moses led them into the Sinai, and to escape their bondage, maybe they were history's first tax exiles. There were probably earlier tax exiles than that, but anyway, let's call them history's first tax exiles. And from there, we have the Ten Commandments, the belief system on which Judaism and indeed Christianity is built. So, founding story, tax story.
Fascinating.
And then, of course, we have Christianity. And we've already talked about how it came to pass that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. They were only in Bethlehem to pay taxes. And tax is a recurring theme throughout Jesus' life. And he was a revolutionary. And if you look at many great revolutionaries, rebels, they were usually tax rebels. Spartacus, Robin Hood, Boadicea, Mahatma Gandhi. They were all tax rebels. And he complained about this, but he complained that the Romans taxed some religions, but not their own, which is what the Romans did. They tolerated other religions, but they taxed them.
The classic
but
temple tax.
He still said that we should pay up lest we should offend them. So he recommended that his people pay their taxes because the consequences of not paying them were not worth it.
So if you worshipped the Roman pantheon of gods, you did not have to pay the tax. But if you were a Jew or a Christian or whatever, Christianity didn't even exist at the time. So if you were a Jew or if you were some other form of pagan, you had to pay the temple tax.
Yeah, precisely. And there's a famous story of Jesus and the Pharisees, and he went inside the temple of Jerusalem and found traders at work, and he began to cast them out. And he was horrified.
So when you say this is what I was confused about. You said traders. You mean like what do you mean?
People buying and selling stuff. Merchants.
Oh, inside the
temple.
Okay, gotcha.
And he didn't like it.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so he cast them out.
Okay.
And of course, the Pharisees and their scribes were horrified because their business had been disrupted, and the revenues they collected for Pontius Pilate, the man responsible for collecting taxes in Judea on behalf of Rome, and their relationship with him was prejudiced because they couldn't collect their taxes and pay him. And so they wanted to get rid of this problematic figure. And so they tried to trick him into incriminating himself. They wanted to trap him in his words. And so they flattered him, they praised him, and then they asked him whether it was right for Jews to pay the taxes demanded by Caesar, hoping that he would say that it wasn't right. And then they would have a reason to hand him over to Pontius Pilate. And they sent spies, Luke tells us, who pretended to be righteous that they might seize on his words in order to deliver him to the power and the authority of the governor. But he knew what they were doing. "Why do you test me, you hypocrites?" he said. "Show me the tax money." One of them showed him a denarius, a Roman coin, silver coin. By the way, it was 20 denarii with the 20 silver coins that Judas betrayed Caesar with. "And whose image and inscription is this?" And they replied, "Caesar's," to which he uttered the immortal line, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And that's one of Jesus' great lines.
Yeah, famous quote.
He got away with it on that occasion.
That time, apparently.
But eventually, the crime for which he was crucified was
sedition.
And Roman citizens couldn't be crucified, only non-Romans. And they're for 3 crimes: attempting to escape from slavery, highway robbery, or piracy and sedition. "We found this fellow perverting the nation," cried the mob who brought Jesus before Pontius Pilate, "and forbidding to give tribute," i.e. tax, "to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king." Now, Roman tolerated other religions, but it would not tolerate other kings because it was a threat to their tax revenue. And sedition, which he encouraged by non-payment of taxes.
So he did eventually say, "Don't pay your taxes." That's kind of what happened.
He is forbidding to give tribute to Caesar later on.
Okay.
And so at the birth of Christ, throughout his story, at his death, there is a tax story.
Fascinating.
And there is a tax story at the heart of Islam as well. One of the best tax stories of the lot. And so Islam began with the Prophet Muhammad and in the 7th century, and it kind of Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire were just exhausted by this point. Rome had already gone. Byzantium was the new Rome, but they were just fighting, conquering. They were exhausted. Within 3 decades of the death of Muhammad, Islam was one of the world's largest empires. It controlled the whole of North Africa, the Middle East. How did it spread so quickly? Once you understand Muslim tax policy, you understand all. And so the first caliph was Abu Bakr, who was Muhammad's father-in-law and his close companion. And what they would do is, they're like the armies of the Roman Republic were volunteers. Conscription only came later, but voluntarism works. And they were rewarded with, when they conquered a country, they were obviously, rewarded with loot and plunder and all the rest of it. And they believed in their mission. But when they first took the Sasanian Empire, which would be that part of the Middle East, Iran and so on, he declared that those who accept Muhammad's religion and pray his prayers would be relieved of taxes.
That's a nice conversion strategy.
Absolutely. One of the most effective in history. So convert to Islam, you don't have to pay tax.
Yeah. Where do I sign?
Yeah.
Allahu Akbar.
I think I'd do the same.
I'm in, baby.
Many of us would. And so the conquered people were given, these were Zoroastrians. They were made to pay a poll tax known as jizya. But again, those who converted to Islam were exempted from it. And even those who did not convert were not badly treated as long as they paid up. But if you failed to pay up, you were either enslaved or killed. So you were given a choice: death, taxes, or Islam. And of course, many chose Islam. And Bakr's successors all followed this similar strategy as they went across North Africa and into Spain. Death to the infidel was the cry, but their success had as much to do with judicious tax policy as it did the sword or the Quran. And conquered people put up little resistance. They'd been taxed very heavily under the Romans, under the Byzantines, under the Sasanians. They were actually glad to be relieved and have this by these light taxing people. Burdens were so grievous, many of the rich and poor denied the faith of the Messiah. In other words, they said, we're not Christians. They were the largest body of converts, was Christians.
Yeah.
And there's a story about a Muslim army retreating from a large body of
Judea story,
of Roman troops. And as they have evacuated, the chief tax collector of the Muslims reimbursed the conquered people's poll tax because the Muslims weren't able to ensure their safety. And the poll tax was nothing but the price of protection. And conquered Christians were brought to tears by the gesture, and they said, "May God bring you back to us." And I think they did. But of course, as the Islamic Empire grew and prospered, it didn't last.
The story is old as time.
The stories, but actually, the fourth caliph, Ali, he had this great quote.
Yeah.
"The proper upkeep of the land in cultivation is of greater importance than the collection of revenue, for revenue cannot be derived until the land is productive." In other words, don't tax them during hard times. And he had this whole thing of not taxing during hard times. Help the economy grow, nurture the economy, and then the revenue will make its way to the exchequer.
That's like the Hong Kong policy in a lot of ways.
It's identical. And he was also insistent that non-Muslim people should not be humiliated. And so this went on, and again, it was very successful, and the early Islamic Empire was a place of great innovation, of great business, of great entrepreneurialism, advances in mathematics, advances in chemistry, advances in what's it called when you not chemistry, alchemy. They were great alchemists. Alchemy was religious,
and all these people, I believe. Was
Archimedes?
Was he Greek?
I think Archimedes was Greek, but I'm not sure he was an alchemist. But
I don't know if he was
the great philosophers, and they brought gunpowder to Europe, early gunpowder, and it was very different to the sort of imposing, restrictive Islam that many of us have in our minds today, in the context of the times.
Yeah. It was,
but gradually, decadence crept in. And it wasn't a republic. There was like one caliph in charge and then lots of people under him. And everyone who was under him just, got their fingers in the till, basically. The very first caliph refunded to the state treasury the entire amount he'd drawn during his caliphate.
Yeah.
But by the 15th century, Islam's golden age was behind it, and higher taxes was the order of the day.
A story as old as time.
And there's a great story where there was the taxes in Egypt got so heavy that the caliph triggered a revolt when he tried to increase land taxes on the day one of his wives wore a 30,000 dinar dress.
And my favorite part was, and that was just one of his wives.
Yeah. Great stuff.
Oh, man.
And so we have this passage, which was there's Ibn Khaldun, who's a famous
Ibn Khaldun, Tunisian guy, yeah.
Tunisian philosopher. And he said, in the early stages of an empire, taxes are light in their incidence, but fetch in large revenue. As time passes and kin succeed each other, they lose their tribal habits in favour of more civilised ones. Their needs and exigencies grow, owing to the luxury in which they've been brought up. Hence they impose fresh taxes on their subjects and sharply raise the rate of old taxes to increase their yield. But the effects on business of this rise in taxation make themselves felt, for businessmen are soon discouraged by the comparison of their profits with the burdens of their taxes. Consequently, production falls off, and with it, the yield of taxation. He might have been describing Rome or Greece before it.
That's classic
or
Rome.
Britain today, or even the US up until last month. So low taxation and small government accompany the ascent of great civilizations, and high taxation their demise. Initially, the Islamic armies brought liberation from taxation, but in time, they imposed it. The annual burden of 1 dinar became 4. Crop taxes became commonplace. There were many stories of taxes taxpayers being humiliated. So, and the people being double taxed. People used to tattoo their tax receipts onto their bodies in order to avoid being double taxed. And so Khaldun was this great Islamic philosopher. And he observed that low rates bring in greater revenue, while higher rates bring in lower taxes.
He was the OG Arthur Laffer.
Exactly. And this was an observation made by David Hume, by Adam Smith, by Keynes made the same observation, JFK, Ronald Reagan. But and in fact, there's a great quote from 1924, your Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon. It seems difficult for some to understand that high rates of taxation do not necessarily mean large revenue to the government, and that more revenue may often be obtained by lower rates. The most famous of the lot was Arthur Laffer, and he drew what became known as the Laffer curve, and he was having lunch with Donald Rumsfeld, I want to say, and Dick Cheney. And he was having, two great beacons of something. And anyway, he was having lunch with them, and he drew this idea of this bell-shaped curve on a napkin. And the high point of the curve is the optimum taxation rate if you're trying to bring in revenue. It's the rate that generates you the most revenue. Once you go above that rate, revenue falls off.
Yeah, the incentive to.
And so that is the point that you obtain the maximum amount of feathers with the least possible hissing. To go back to that.
Well, it might be just the right amount of hissing.
Well, it depends. It depends whose side you are on this, because that's the point of maximum revenue for the government. But you might not think the point of maximum revenue to the government is necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, I agree.
But in any case, that became known as the Laffer curve, and it's since been disproved by left-wing economists. But I think it's one of those commonsensical things.
Well, I will say
we
that
all know
it's still taught in the public education system. So at least when I was there, they still do teach you about Arthur Laffer and the Laffer curve. So
Okay, and JFK got it as well. It's a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high today and tax revenues are too low, and the soundest way to raise the revenues in the long run is to cut the tax rates. But it's a lesson that we never seem to
remember.
Like, we have this new chancellor in the UK, Rachel Reeves, and we've unwisely, but for whatever reason, we've elected a left-wing government in the UK. We had the budget last November. She's put up tax after tax after tax, and the economy's fallen off a cliff. And so revenue has gone down with her high tax rates, and she can't understand why. And they're doing all this stuff. Britain is open for business, and tax them so much, and business will come to Britain quite naturally. And you don't need to go on Twitter and tell everyone how Britain's open for business.
This brings us to the greatest constitutional document of all time. Let's talk about it.
We can talk about that, and we can talk about the Rosetta Stone as well.
Oh yeah, let's do the Rosetta Stone,
which is
that's
like
an interesting one.
In the British Museum, it's supposed to be the most valuable single item in the British Museum. The Elgin marbles might have something to say about that, but I guess there's more than one. But anyway, it's this ancient document written, or it's a fragment of a larger piece of stone written. It was discovered by Napoleon's armies in the city of Rashi, which was then called Rosetta, and it was confiscated, and somehow or other it made its way to the British Museum, as all things should. And but it's written in 3 different languages, and so it's incredibly important, and it's one of the oldest surviving written documents in the world, and we know it's supremely important because it was inscribed in stone. And it's written in 3 different languages. And so because of that, it's enabled us to understand ancient languages, which we otherwise wouldn't be able to do. But it was basically a tax document. It was a tax amnesty at the end of a war, and decreeing Ptolemy V has dedicated the temple's revenues in money and corners, undertaken much outlay to bring Egypt into prosperity. And he forgives debts. It's basically a tax amnesty.
You called it a reflation plan. I've heard that term.
Have you not heard that?
No.
Well, the idea of a reflation plan is when there's no money in the economy, and so you find a way. Quantitative easing was a reflation plan,
okay.
But another way of reflating, you couldn't print gold and silver in those days. So the way to reflate was not to take taxes and leave the money in the economy and let the economy grow that way. And and they tax documents, for obvious reasons, are because it's the revenue of the government, are usually really well kept, and so they make a great source for the historian. And again, historians will often find ancient tax documents, and that's where they learn a great deal about a society.
Fascinating.
So, the greatest constitutional document of all time.
This is my favorite tax. This is tax. They talk about this one on this channel. It made me laugh.
So we're in medieval England now, and we've talked about how leaders use a moral justification to impose a tax. And you even see it in the language of tax. Tax is your duty, your tribute, your due, all these kind of words. And often knights might not have wanted to follow their king to the Holy Land and participate in their crusades, and more likely lose their life to it. And so the king very generously said that you don't have to come, but if you don't want to have to come, you have to pay scutage. You have to pay a tax instead. Scutage, it was probably. Scutage. SCUTAGE. And but it was known as the cowardice tax.
I like that.
How about that guilt? I've paid the cowardice tax. I don't have to go to fight. And Saladin, the Islamic leader, destroyed the Crusaders. And the Crusaders needed to raise more funds. So they went back to the tax man. And they raised this thing. Henry II in England laid a special tithe called the Saladine tithe, and it was the greatest, one of the greatest taxes ever seen in this country. And you were given, if you were a knight going to fight, you were let off this thing, but it was a tax on arms, horses, garments, and appurtenance of whatever sort used by clerks. Everyone paid, and it raised something like, it was the largest tax ever collected in England, and it wasn't popular. And the Archbishop of Canterbury had helped raise the money, and he disappeared to Wales for a year afterwards. And Henry II never made the crusade. He raised all this money with the Saladin tithe and never went to fight. He spent the money fighting with the French, and then he died a year later. And so Richard the Lionheart, now because his name's Lionheart, the English always think Richard the Lionheart was a great king.
Such a great name.
In the film with Kevin Costner, Richard the Lionheart was played by Sean Connery, so everyone thinks Richard the Lionheart's a great guy. But in his 10-year reign, Richard the Lionheart spent less than 6 months in England, and he saw it as a place to be taxed rather than live in. And straight away, he raised another tithe, and then he went off to fight Saladin. I think he lost. On his way back, he was then kidnapped by the Holy Roman Empire.
They took him hostage.
Who demanded £100,000 of silver. Now, of course, a pound of silver was once the pound. That's where it derives. But it was a unit of account. There wasn't a coin that was a pound in weight. And it was the same amount that the Saladin tithe had raised the previous year, was then demanded in ransom. And of course, because it was the king, another tithe was raised to secure his release. And this time the clergy wasn't exempted, and they brought in a new land tax as well. And so Richard was eventually freed, and he went back and he went to France, didn't even come back to England.
So who took him?
The Holy Roman Emperor, which would be Germany.
Oh, Germany. Okay, yeah. Germany at the time.
And then Richard was succeeded by his brother John, who, funnily enough, had actually tried to bribe the Holy Roman Emperor to keep Richard for longer.
I'll give you £200,000 of silver if you keep his ass.
So that he could become king. Oh. And King John was, of course, one of the most infamous tax collectors in history, gives us rise to Robin Hood and all those stories. And he just taxed and taxed and taxed. There were export duties. He raised cowardice tax 11 times in his 17-year reign. When I say raised it, I mean he imposed it 17 times.
He's one of my favorites. He's a nice. He was an entrepreneur too. I mean, he said, "Hey, I'm gonna sell the right for you to be a tax sheriff."
He was like, he would make USA look morally upright in comparison to King John. He did export duties. He imposed inheritance taxes. He sold sheriff.
That's what I was talking about. I love it.
Oh yeah, it's great. And then the sheriffs had to raise tax to pay off what they owed him for the sheriff.
Oh man,
I think that's where we get the Sheriff of Nottingham story from. And he also sold the rights to establish new towns. And the town of Liverpool, the city of Liverpool, was founded on one such right. Jewish people, not for the first time in their history, had a special tax imposed on them. They'd already been targeted in the Saladin tithe. Man. They now had another tallage of 1210, and that left them £44,000 of silver worst off. He taxed widows who wished to remain single, even if they'd lost their husband in the Crusades. And then we got a shortage of, these things always seem to happen in tandem. We got a succession of poor harvests. So there was a shortage of food and rising prices. And we got a recoinage. He tried to stop the inflation with the recoinage, and that didn't work. And so the barons, who were kind of the next down in the hierarchy, had had enough. And they went to, they rose up against John, and they met him on the banks of the River Thames, a place called Runnymede. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langdon, brokered an agreement between the barons and the king. New taxes could only be levied with the consent of the barons. And this was the beginning of Parliament. Parliament stopping the king's power. Because we saw in the English Civil War, what got in the way of the king's revenue was the fact that Parliament was now in charge of collecting taxes. This began with the barons. Limits were placed on cowardice tax, on scutage, and other forms of feudal taxes. Barons were protected from illegal imprisonment. The church was also protected to an extent. And in exchange for this agreement, the barons agreed to vacate London. And both sides didn't keep their word.
Shocker.
Both sides went back on their word. It's always the way. This is the amazing thing about medieval times. Everyone went into an agreement expecting the other person not to keep their side of the deal. And so, the King John then went to the Pope, who declared the charter shameful, and he had all the rebel barons excommunicated, which was a big deal in those days. Excommunication was kind of like being cancelled today.
Yeah.
It was the cancel culture of its time. And the barons, meanwhile, didn't vacate London because they knew John was going to think. So they went to war again. And then John died in the war. But he didn't die because he lost a battle. He died of, I think he got dysentery, something like that. And so John's son was Henry III, but he was only 9. And we got a 9-year-old king. And he became under this protection of this chap called William the Marshal, William Marshal. The example of how your job becomes your surname. Marshal, a very common surname, but William the Marshal, William Marshal. And he was, according to the Archbishop, he was the best knight that had ever lived. And he was quite the character, this William Marshal. He'd served under 4 kings, and he was a loyalist. He was on King John's side, and he was still charging into battle at the age of 70.
Oh, wow.
And if you go to Kilkenny in Southern Ireland, you'll see this magnificent castle built by the same William Marshal. He was quite the most impressive man. And Marshal knew that he needed, with a 9-year-old king, there was essentially a power vacuum. He also knew that at the age of 70, his days were numbered.
Oh, yeah.
70 was an extraordinary age to have lived at that time.
Yeah.
And he wanted to ensure peace and stability for the 9-year-old monarch. And he was loyal to the crown, but he was also clever enough to see the damaging effects of all these taxes that they'd had. And so he decided that this charter that had been agreed between the barons and the kings was his best chance. So he got the failed charter made on the banks of the Thames 2 years previously, and he ignored criticism that he was being too generous to the barons. And he himself would be one of the witnessing barons, and it was called the Great Charter, from which we get the name Magna Carta. And it's the sort of defining British document. Now, not only is it the defining British document, it is the defining American document. And again, Henry III reissued the charter in exchange for permission to levy taxes, and then Edward I did the same. So it just became part of our law. And there was a British judge, Lord Denning, he called it the greatest constitutional document ever made. That's where we got the expression that we began the chapter up. And if you actually look, I think there's like 2 clauses in the entire charter that remain as law. And like most of it was abandoned pretty soon afterwards. But the myth of what the charter meant lived on in people's minds. It's an iconic myth, a symbol of freedom, and it persisted throughout the English Civil War when it was argued that Magna Carta made the king subject to the law, that the king didn't have divine right.
It was a social contract between people and their government, essentially. I mean, it provided some, level of fairness there.
Sure. And it gave us trial by jury.
Yeah.
It was important in the political thinking of the Glorious Revolution, which was, led to the sort of the beginning of Great Britain and the beginning of central banking. But when the colonists set off for the New World, they had this mentality of that was instilled in them by Magna Carta. And, this was their rights. This was their fundamental rights. And so when they fought against their English overlords in the American War of Independence, they didn't believe they were fighting for new freedoms. They thought they were fighting for freedoms that already existed.
Yeah.
They were just fighting to retain what was theirs, and freedoms that were enshrined in Magna Carta. So this guy, William Marshal, who in resurrecting this document kind of gave us the American Constitution. It's all built around Magna Carta.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why it's just the most incredibly influential document, even though most of it is actually myth.
Yeah.
and lives on in our heads.
I think the Fifth Amendment of our Constitution.
And I think, the Fifth Amendment, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that's one of the 3 clauses of Magna Carta that remained in English common law. And it's almost worded almost exactly the same if you read the Magna Carta with a little bit of medieval, oldie English thrown in. And FDR quoted it in his inauguration speech of 1941, and it was conceived some 700 years earlier in reaction to King John and his pernicious taxation. It shaped the national mentality of the United States. And even today, it's still a great part of this character, your nation's character. And, you are the most important country on earth. And this whole thing that's happening now with Musk and Trump, we keep calling back to it, what's going on. But it's all going back to the Constitution, which all goes back to Magna Carta and these silly taxes imposed by King John. Anywhere they went, they targeted any buildings, lawyers mainly, that had records of they went to every prison and they opened the prison and freed all the prisoners, because so many of the prisoners were just too less to pay their taxes. And then any buildings that contained records, they burnt down. So they literally burnt down the IRS. They just destroyed all the tax records, because once those records are gone, nobody knows anything. And it was, they targeted lawyers. And Shakespeare actually wrote a play in which he depicted the peasants' revolt. And the famous line in the play is, what should we do? What should we do when we win? And the line was, first, let us kill all the lawyers.
Welcome back to another episode of Cypherpunks. Today, we're going to start our 4th part of our series on Daylight Robbery, Dominic Frisby's book about the history of taxation. Today, we're going to talk about the Black Death, tax structure of Europe, and modern nation states and taxes. Dominic, welcome back to the pod.
Thank you very much. And yes, we're going to discover how tax systems defined the modern nations that we know today. And later in the series, we're going to discover how the same tax systems that defined the modern nations that we know today are also going to spell the end of the modern nations that we know today. But given that we're starting with the Black Death, and the Black Death was very important in the destiny of Europe because it changed the status of the serf. And the serf is the descendant of the Roman slave, basically, and he was tied to the land. But I wanted to tell you a story before we get to the Black Death, which I just think as a Bitcoiner you will like.
I'll love it. Real quick question. Before I forget my question, because I've been meaning to ask you this since I read your book. Earlier on, we talked in the book about about how the window tax affected, the windows and stuff, of how people started building buildings without windows and more disease spread. Do you think the Black Death was impacted by that at all? I know we know it came on rats on ships and spread that way, but do you think the fact that some of this architecture was still there?
No, the Black Death was several hundred years earlier.
Okay, it was earlier. Okay.
Yeah, it was before the window tax. The Black Death was in the sort of, I think I want to say 13 something, and the window tax came several hundred years later.
Oh, I was confused because we start earlier, but we're bouncing.
Yeah, no, we're bouncing around. We're bouncing around.
Perfect.
So, I'm part Italian, and so I sort of know lots of Italians in London, and we all talk about the fact that we've got Italian grandparents. And one of my good friends, who is probably watched more Michael Saylor videos in greater detail than anyone, Italian comedian called Stefano, brilliant comedian, totally unrecognized. But his grandparents were Italian, living in not far from Rome, in the countryside, and they were what's called mezzadri, which would literally translate as sharecroppers. And they were basically the modern descendants of serfs, and we're in the 1960s now. And the life of the mezzadro would be that you worked the land, and half of what you produced on the land you would have to give to the person that owned the land, and the other half you got to keep yourself and you could go and sell that in the market, and that's how you earned your living. And this had been their existence for many, many generations, hundreds of years. And no one in the family had ever owned land. And in the 1960s, they, like many Italians, you'll find, we everywhere in the world has got a Chinese restaurant and an Irish theme bar. And a lot of the time, it's also got an Italian restaurant as well. And Italians are great immigrants. And of course, millions of immigrants from Italy came to the United States. But in any case, in the 1960s, two of them, among many, came to England. They came to London. And the protectionist employment laws in the UK at the time meant that most Italians came to London and they had cousins or family or friends. And so they would work in ice cream shops, restaurants, cafes. Sometimes they would go down the mines, actually. But there was all sorts of protectionism against protecting the British worker. So they tended to do cash in hand jobs in those kind of situations. But two things happened. Because they were being paid cash in hand, they tended not to pay income tax. And you got lots of tax and lots of tips and so on.
Sounds familiar.
It sounds familiar. And then the second thing that happened is that in the 60s, the Italian lira, which was their currency then, was a total basket case. And, it's a joke how many zeros kept getting added to the lira because it kept being debased.
Wow.
And they were being paid in the British pound at the time, which was not exactly an exemplary currency, but compared to the Italian lira, it was.
Well, isn't the British pound right now is the longest lasting currency that's been, isn't it detached fiat currency?
Yeah, it's the oldest currency.
That's a fiat currency still.
Yeah, it's the oldest currency. I think it's the oldest currency, assuming gold and silver you don't count as currencies, or let's say the oldest national currency.
That's what I'm
still
saying.
in use today.
It's lost 99.9% of its value relative to gold.
I think even more than that.
It's probably more than that at this point, but it is the longest lived fiat currency because most fiat currencies average lifespan.
It's even it wasn't always a fiat currency. Initially, a pound was a pound of sterling silver, and in fact, the pound was designed. It was based on the Roman system of money, and so our word for a
pound
penny,
sterling.
Yeah, but a pound was a pound of sterling. There wasn't a coin that was a pound in weight. It was a unit of account. But our penny, the symbol used to be the D, which derives from the Roman denarius. And if you think of the pound sign, it's actually an elaborate L, which comes from the Roman libra, which means a pound. But in any case. So yes, the pound is an old currency, and it's been through many debasements. The pound has lost something close to 40% of its value just since 2020.
Wow!
In the 5 years since 2020, it's just been awful. Wow. That's why every time we British come to the States, I keep. How many times have I been moaning about how expensive America is? It's because the pound is so crap. In 2010,
good thing you got a benefactor.
Yeah, in 2007, 2000. Yes, exactly. Thank you.
What a sucker.
In 2007, just before the financial crisis, it was $2.10 was a pound. Now it's $1.20.
Wow.
So we've lost close to over 40% just against the dollar.
Wow.
And then you think about what the dollar's lost.
Well, yeah, that's insane.
Yeah. In any case, so my friend's grandparents came to Britain, and they were working cash in hand, being paid in pounds. And I think they came in 65 and it's 68. So just 3 years, they went back to Italy. And because the Italian lira had lost so much money and they were being paid in pounds, they were able to buy an apartment for the very first time. So they were the first family, the first people in the history of that family ever to own any kind of real estate.
That's unbelievable.
So the entire destiny of that family was changed. And then 2 years after that, they bought the land on which they had been mezzadri. Do you see what I mean? So they totally changed the existence of that family, which had been in place for generations, hundreds of years. And the reason was they worked and saved in strong currency, and they spent in weak currency.
Yeah.
And precisely that, it's absolutely. And I think Gresham, we may even be mentioning him later in the program. And it's precisely that dynamic why I keep talking about why you should save in Bitcoin and gold and strong money.
I teach everybody that I know.
Yeah.
Everybody that'll listen, right?
Yeah. And you know how many Bitcoiners just on ordinary salaries, you cannot change your existence on an ordinary salary the way, because of the tax structure, because of income tax and everything, and fiat money. If you just have an ordinary job, and because of mass immigration pushing down the price of labor, if you have an ordinary job in Western Europe or United States or anywhere, you cannot change your existence doing an ordinary job unless you save in strong currency.
It's unbelievable.
It's the only way you can do it.
Corruption of money has affected civilization and affected people and families, and it's wild. Wild. Think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many rabbit holes we could go down right now. It reminds me of, I'm not sure where I heard you talking about this, but the situation in Cuba with the dollar and the black markets and how the money's corrupted the society. That's another 30-minute conversation.
That was one my.
We'll save that.
My first time I realized that socialism might not be all it's cracked up to be. 1994 in Cuba, and where an ordinary young girl of 18 years old could earn more in a night as a hooker, or a taxi driver could earn more just from one journey than a university professor or an engineer or a doctor could earn in a month.
Yeah, I think I heard you saying that. Fuck it, we'll go down the rabbit hole. We're here. We might as well. Yeah. I think you said that, imagine being a father and having, or a mother and having a daughter and being like, hey, don't go be a doctor or a lawyer, be a prostitute and hang out by the airport. I mean, that is how corrupted that society is. I mean, it breaks my heart.
Parents wanted their sons to be taxi drivers and waiters and their daughters to be hookers, because that's how they came into contact with foreign currency, with strong money.
Wow.
The only way they could get dollars.
Unbelievable.
And it wasn't even that the peso had been devalued. You could not buy stuff with pesos. It just wasn't available. I was an intrepid backpacker in those days, and I thought, I'll get off the beaten track. I'll get off the beaten path. You could not buy stuff. The only way you could get a pair of jeans, some meat, was with US dollars. Bizarrely, in government shops. This is how hypocritical it was, in government US dollar shops. It was nuts. It was the most distorted society I've ever seen. And I think the low point in Cuba's history was with the boat people, would have been probably 92, 93, and I was there in 94. So just a year or two off the bottom of the market, if you like. And it was an extraordinary country. And Cuba was rich. It was like Las Vegas.
It was like the crown jewel of the Gulf or something like that. I remember into like that.
All the Americans used to go there and spend their dollars on holiday, and the buildings in Havana are amazing. And these huge, great 1950s US vehicles, and then these 1970s Russian larders. Driving around.
And then they essentially just seized everybody's personal property. I mean, that's kind of what they did, and they said everything belongs to the government now.
Yeah, and it was this crazy, and they became allies of Russia, and Russia had this sort of communist ally right, in America's chin. And it was crazy, and it was the only place I've ever been like. It's very similar to Morocco, bizarrely, Cuba, in that the people, the system of rule was so fanatical that the people were scared to say anything. So it was all whispers and secrets and lies, and that's how people survived. And it just reminded me of Morocco, but people would sort of look round and they'd go, oh, Castro's wonderful, he's great. And then they'd come up to you and they'd whisper and they'd go, I hate Castro.
Wow.
Anyway, crazy place. But let's come to the Peasants' Revolt and the Black Death. So the system of rule, we call it feudalism today, but they didn't call it feudalism at the time. But you basically had the king at the top who'd acquired his status from God, and he owned everything. And he would then give some of the land to the church and some of the land to the barons. And in exchange for the land that he gave them, the barons would give the king a share of their produce, their revenues, their service. They would give them their knights and soldiers when he wanted to go to war, and of course their loyalty. And then one down from the barons, it went all the way down the food chain, lords, until you got to serfs at the very bottom. And these were guys, as I said, were the descendants of the Roman slave. And the serf would have a little bit of land which he had to work, and everything he produced on that land he would have to give to his lord half the week, and the other half the week he got to keep what he worked for. So not unlike the Western worker today, half he has to give to his lord, the state, and the other half he gets to keep. And then, of course, once he had his grain or whatever that he'd harvested, he would have to go to the mill of his lord, and then his lord took another bit off, as lords, states or governments, whoever the system of rule is, tends to do. And serfs were tied to the land. You couldn't be an entrepreneurial serf and go, right, that's it, I'm leaving. Because if you did that, you became an outlaw. A bit like Robin Hood was an outlaw. And you just sort of went into the woods and attempted to survive in the woods or whatever. And it sounds quite glamorous. I'm an outlaw, I'm free. But life would have been pretty hard. And you couldn't go into villages or anything like that as an outlaw. Then in the mid 14th century, we got the Black Death. And we don't quite know how many people the Black Death killed because records are not that accurate. But it's generally thought 50 million people. Yeah. Even more than COVID.
I want to say it took out, 50 to 60% of the population.
60% of the population of Europe. Yeah. And when you think 50 million people, there were not that many people then.
Yeah.
And so 60% of Europe lost their life. And it was just bizarre. It was especially devastating in rural areas, more so than in cities.
Why? Why do you think that is?
Know.
You think it's because people in cities were used to being constantly sick because there's all this immune systems would be stronger?
Maybe their immune systems were better. I don't know why.
Yeah, because you're just constantly
maybe it was just the rats or the filth were more prevalent in the countryside. I don't know. But anyway, it hurt the countryside more. And what suddenly happened is, so Britain's population has fallen by 2/3. And in fact, the whole of Europe's has. And what suddenly happens is, for the first time in history, there is a shortage of labor. There literally aren't the people to do the jobs. And so serfs are suddenly in short supply. And it's like the opposite to what's happened with immigration. Immigration has increased the amount of labor, and so people are able to pay less for their labor. The opposite happened then. And so wages actually went up, and serfs were able to just leave the land to which they'd been tied for generations and go and work on another. And to keep them, lords would start paying them money. And in fact, land, which had been a premium, a lot of land just fell into disrepair. Land was no longer valuable. It was labor, but it was suddenly the value thing. So it transformed the economy. And many serfs' lords had died in the Black Death, so they just found themselves lordless and thus free. And so they didn't even have to buy their freedom. And so there was suddenly this sort of upwardly mobile dynamic, and peasants were handling money for the first time. Coin, silver coin. And of course, the ruling classes hated it. And so they legislated against it. We had a statute of Labourers Act. Can you imagine this? It set out the maximum daily pay. So instead of a minimum wage, there was a maximum wage. And for everyone, farmers, saddlers, tailors, fishmongers, butchers, they were all given maximum wages. And people were they were not allowed to charge more for their goods and services than had been the case before the plague, even though the economy had totally changed.
Yeah.
So it's like printing a load of money and then having a go at the merchant because he's increased his prices to reflect the change in economic circumstances, and then going, no, you have to charge what you charged before we printed all this money.
It's pretty much what they did in ancient Rome. They did price controls.
Yeah, they did price controls. They never worked.
Flip the coins. Yeah, of course not. People just left the city and said, fuck this. This doesn't make sense.
And then at one point, this new rich class started eating better food. So they got stronger and they started dressing in better clothes. And the reaction of the legislation was a thing called the Sumptuary Act, which passed limits to the food, to their diet and the food they could eat. And it said you can only wear clothes of this quality and this color in order to stop them wearing the clothes of their superiors.
Man,
it's unbelievable what rulers do to their people.
Listen, you will own nothing and you will be happy, Dominic.
There you go.
You better eat some fucking crickets, Frisby.
So Britain at this time, we're in the 1370s now. Britain and France are in one of their wars. This is the 100 Years' War, and they're in the middle of that. And we've got the king, Richard II, who's another child king. So the richest man in the country is this chap called John o' Gaunt, who's Richard II's uncle. and effectively he's running the country, and he controls the war, and he goes off to France to fight a battle, and he needs to fund his battle. So he levies Britain's first poll tax, and this is a tax on your head, on who you are, by head. And this is the point at which we're getting surnames for the first time, because you need to distinguish who's, John from the Hill, from John the Smith, from John's son, so that they all make sure they pay their taxes. And it was quite a successful tax, levied quite a lot of money. And as I say, people were handing coin for the first time. It's not that there were no longer serfs. A lot of serfs had escaped their thing. And then there was a sort of a working class, an artisanal class.
The emergence of the middle class is really
I suppose so, in a way, yeah.
Sounds like
something like that.
The feudal system there was no middle class. It was, you were low class and,
Well, there were knights and, different things. Anyway.
But knights to me would be almost like the way I think about knights is like you're a government employee almost. Like that's kind of how I always think about that.
Yeah, I think they were one down from barons.
You're a bureaucrat essentially. You're not.
Yeah, well, you had to go and fight.
You're sponsored
good
by
at
the
fighting.
government. Yeah, you're the military.
Yeah, military-industrial complex. So he levies this poll tax, and it raises a reasonable amount of money. And in fact, it does so well. He goes, right, the following year, he levies another one. And the second one doesn't levy quite a lot as much money. And he sends out, there are commissioners who are tax farmers, basically, people on commission, who are sent out to collect this money. And one of them was a chap called Thomas Bampton. And at this point, John o' Gaunt has levied a third poll tax. And this one has done really, really badly. It's raised like a quarter of what was expected. And he's like, what's going on? Why is nobody paying this tax? And so he sends out these commissioners to collect the money. And this chap called Thomas Bampton arrived in a village called Fobbing in Essex. And there was this thing going on at the time where women above a certain age had to pay the tax. And if you were below a certain age, you were exempt. So you had this situation where tax collectors were lifting up women's skirts in order to check whether they were of age, or not.
I don't think that went over very well.
I don't think it did. And one of the tax collectors did this to a guy called Walter the Tiler. He was a tiler of roofs and a low person, but his name, we know him as Wat Tyler. And he did this to Wat Tyler's daughters, one of Wat Tyler's daughters. And of course, Wat Tyler went absolutely apeshit. He'd been a longbowman in France, fighting in France. So he was an experienced soldier, knew what he was doing. And he went apeshit, and he would become the leader of the peasants' revolt. And in any case, this chap Bampton turns up in this village called Fobbing in Essex. And this is not just, it's happening in every village across the country.
If they haven't, they need to do a Netflix series on all this because it's
they
probably already have.
I'm writing a stage musical about it.
Really?
Yeah.
Really, yeah.
And if anyone else nicks my idea, I will kill them.
Well, you guys heard it here first.
Yeah. So in any case, this guy Bampton shows up in this village in Essex, which Essex is just to the east of London, and to collect the money that's supposed to be paid. And Tom Baker, who's standing for the village of people, he goes, "No, we're not paying you." And Bampton, what do you mean you're not paying us? And Bampton orders him to pay, and they have a fight. And all Bampton's men are killed.
Oh, man.
And Bampton runs away and manages to escape. And thus does the peasants' revolt begin. And this is one of the questions, like what I like about medieval times is that even though the soldiers would have been better trained and better armed, the gap between an ordinary person and a soldier in terms of the weapons that were available was not that big.
It was not the same, yeah.
Whereas in England now, we're not allowed to carry guns.
Insane. Absolutely
I know you
insane.
think we're nuts.
It's insane.
Whereas, and the state is armed. So we literally cannot rise up and revolt because one group is armed and the other is not. At least in America, because you're all armed, you're in a position to better hold your...
That's the point. I mean, that's
your leaders to account.
That's the point of the Constitution. I mean, it literally says, I think somewhere in the Constitution it says something like this is we have a constitutional duty to, I think it's Thomas Jefferson. He says something on Paul. Can you look this up on Grok? Or I think he says something like something about liberty and being refreshed by blood every so often or something like that. Like the whole point of this is so we can hold our governments to account.
Yeah.
To keep the balance of power, almost like the Magna Carta, right? It's
sure
similar to that.
And
it's based off of a lot of that.
It's why you need gold and silver as well.
The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Thomas Jefferson's quote often referenced this. The quote comes from a letter Jefferson wrote to William Smith on November 13, 1787. Here's a bit more context about the quote to better understand Jefferson's perspective. We won't go down the rabbit hole of all of that, but
great quote.
He basically says, the quote reflects Jefferson's belief in the necessity of vigilance and, if necessary, revolution to maintain liberty. However, it's important to interpret this in the historical context of the late 18th century, blah, 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 blah. Here comes all the woke stuff at the end of the...
Yeah, this is great.
I think it just stands for itself. You don't need to justify and say all this shit. I think it's very clear when the quote's very clear.
Yeah, don't explain, don't apologize.
I don't want your woke opinion at the bottom of this.
Yeah. And, but in any case, it's what's happening now. In the States, we keep saying this over the course of this series. It is happening again now.
Yeah.
Tree of Liberty is being refreshed.
Yeah, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It's a powerful, powerful quote.
So the sort of ideological leader of the Peasants' Revolt, the Peasants' Revolt's Javier Milei, or the Peasants' Revolt's Murray Rothbard, or Milton Friedman, or whoever it is, was a chap called John Ball.
I like this guy. He seemed like
he
was
is
the guy.
A dude.
He's the fucking man.
He is the man.
Classy guy.
Yeah.
They fucking hung this guy. I mean, he said, look, renounce what you believe in. And he's like, nope.
No,
I believe in this.
He died on that hill. And
I'll even say, the message that was put out, although they lost the revolution, it's like they lost the battle, but I feel like they won the war.
Yeah. Because
England was so hesitant, the leadership after that was so hesitant to raise all these taxes for, the next century or two. It was like that lesson that they learned, it stuck with them.
We never got poll taxes again.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Until Margaret Thatcher.
They lost them.
And they brought down Thatcher as well.
Which is crazy too. I mean, we'll get there, but I mean, it seemed like she was just trying to hold everything accountable and kind of it didn't seem like she was the bad guy.
She was misrepresented.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this guy Ball was a dude, and he'd go around doing the equivalent of being on Twitter all day. He'd go around preaching all around the country, and he would so much so that he got banned from preaching. He got cancelled, and he got excommunicated, cancelled time and time again. But he was popular with the ignorant people, said a chronicler at the time. And the
deplorables, as they call us today.
Yeah,
they call us the deplorables. That's what he is.
And his listeners, he always strove to entice listeners to his sermons by pleasing words and slander of the prelates. So I love that. And he was a proper, some say he was a Marxist, but let's say he was a libertarian Marxist, because there is such a thing. And things will not go well in England until everything is held in common. They are dressed in velvet and furs while we wear only cloth. They have wine and spices and good bread while we have rye bread and water. They have fine houses and manors, and we have to brave the wind and rain as we toil in the fields. It is by the sweat of our brows that they maintain their high state. We are called serfs, and we are beaten if we do not perform our task. That was one of his speeches. Great stuff. And he became such a thorn in the Archbishop of Canterbury's side. The Archbishop of Canterbury is like the number one guy in the English church. And that eventually he was locked up and in Maidstone Castle in Kent. And he said, I'm going to be freed by 20,000 men. And he was. Which tells me they planned this. This whole thing was organized. We sort of think it was a spontaneous uprising.
Yeah.
It was planned.
Wow.
And Ball was behind the whole thing. And what Tyler?
They got to make Paul, is there a Netflix series about this? Because if there's not,
just stop it. I'm writing the musical.
No, write the musical.
Like the best story ever.
You got the musical, baby. But I'm talking about like Netflix right now should be paying us to.
Well,
they should have you direct this fucking thing.
Yeah, well, they do. If anyone nicks this off me, I will die. Because anyway,
say John Ball, Walt Tyler,
and so it's part of English folklore. It's one of our great stories. Anyway, all over Kent and Essex and a surrounding
Nothing.
London.
No series.
No series.
So
just
The
don't.
Last Kingdom. That's what you were talking about.
You got us the Four Horsemen.
That's fictional.
That's earlier, yeah.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
But like, don't give them ideas unless I write it,
They need to have
because
you.
they'll mess it up.
I mean, they need to have you write it.
Of course
seriously.
they do, but they'll get some stupid bloke from Hollywood to do it. And they did this. There were so people were rising up all around the country, and they would do this thing: is they would behead the tax collectors and put their heads on poles.
man. Gosh.
And so to deter tax collectors from coming to their village. And within a week of that first riot, Tom the Baker, rebels in Kent and Essex had mobilised, and they went to Maidstone Castle, and his prediction was true. He was freed by 20,000 men. And then they marched on London, but they stopped in Canterbury on the way. And the Archbishop of Canterbury legged it from Canterbury. He went to London. And Wat Tyler was their leader, experienced soldier. And they did this thing, which anywhere they went, they targeted any buildings, lawyers mainly, that had records of they went to every prison, and they opened the prison and freed all the prisoners, because so many of the prisoners were just people who paid their taxes. And then any buildings that contained records, they burnt down. So they literally burnt down the IRS. They just destroyed all the tax records, because once those records are gone, nobody knows anything. And it was, they targeted lawyers. And Shakespeare actually wrote a play in which he depicted the peasants' revolt. And the famous line in the play is, "What should we do? What should we do when we win?" And the line was, "First, let us kill all the lawyers." And that's the line from the play. But so they particularly also targeted the church, was responsible for collecting a lot of the taxes, Archbishop of Canterbury, and they were really looking for the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was one of the ringleaders in the tax collection. And this is when they were really brilliant. They then marched on London. But when they marched on London, they knew that John of Gaunt was not in London with the army. He was in Scotland fighting off the Scots. So they marched on London when there was nobody, there was no army there. And so they knew that as well. This is why I keep saying the whole thing was planned.
Yeah.
And one chronicler says 200,000 were in the army. We don't know.
Oh my goodness, that's quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean,
Might be a little bit of an embellishment.
I think so. But in any case, but they didn't have a beat. They still believed that the king was there because of God. And they thought Richard II, who was, at this point, he was 12 or 13, they thought he was a good man who was just badly advised. And once he heard their case, he would be on their side. This was their fundamental mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And so they arrived, they marched over Blackheath, which is a well-known part of southeast London, and they arrived at the River Thames at Rotherhithe. And we've got London Bridge, and the Londoners were all on the side of the rebels. And so when they got to London Bridge, the Londoners would just open the gates to the city and let them all in. And they did the same with the Essex rebels arrived in East London as well. But they were supposed to meet with the king. The king was supposed to meet with them. And the king was in Windsor. He came up the River Thames by barge, and he met them on the River Thames at Rotherhithe. And this was the point at which he was going to part. They were going to speak to him and explain their grievances and hopefully resolve it all. But the king's advisors, when they saw how many people were there, they wouldn't let him leave it. They wouldn't let the king leave the barge. Mm-hmm. And so the conversation never happened. They saw the king saw the people there, and then they just left and went back to the city. So anyway, so the troublemakers carried on, and they went into London, and they totally sacked London. Mm-hmm. John of Gaunt lived by the river in a place called the Savoy, now the Savoy Hotel. They totally trashed his house. He was the richest man in the country. And they did it. And they burnt his furniture. They smashed his metalwork. They ground up his jewelry. They set fire to his records. And they threw... This is the thing.
They didn't take it.
They didn't steal it. Because they felt that would be wrong. They just destroyed it. And they threw it all in the river. So the next day, and at this stage, they're drinking. And I think drink was an important part of warfare. It just was. People drunk to get the courage up to
actually
all the way, get energy and so on. So the king meets with the soldiers outside the city, the following day, and just outside the walls of the city. And we talked about before when Magna Carta was signed how nobody believed the deal that was done. And so this skullduggery was the deal of the day. And the peasants laid out their demands. They wanted an end to the poll tax. They wanted the abolition of serfdom. Men should be employed to work, not compelled. They wanted free trade to be able to buy and sell goods as they wished. They wanted rent caps and an end to feudal fines. And they wanted charters that guaranteed them the rights and privileges of free men, as well as pardons for those who had been part of the rebellion. And then they drew up a list of traitors, like the really bad people. So it was like drawing up a list and having Elizabeth Warren and AOC,
Gary Gensler,
and all these, all these bad guys, Ben Bernanke and various others. And they wanted this list, and they were all to be executed. And the king agreed to all their demands, and he gave them their charters of freedom. So there were two branches of people. There were people who came up from Kent, and there were people who came from Essex. And this was to all the Essex people. And the Essex people all got their charters, and they were like, oh, we've got it. We've won. We've got what we agreed to. I've got my charter of my freedom. And they all went home, all the Essex and the Hertfordshire.
Oh, really?
Whereas Wat Tyler, meanwhile, with the Kentish rebels, was in another part, and they got inside the Tower of London. And there they found the Archbishop of Canterbury and this other guy, Sir Robert Hales, who was the king's treasurer, and they found John Legge, who was the tax commissioner. And they dragged them all out into the street and beheaded them.
Oh, my goodness.
And put their heads on poles.
Yikes.
And so this kind of went against what had just happened in this other part of town, against the agreement.
Because they said that the king said he was going to deal with it, right?
Yeah.
And they kind of...
But they didn't know that because they weren't there.
Ah, okay.
Because they were the Kentish rebels.
Ah.
And in any case, no matter what, they wanted these guys. And they were probably in a frenzy because of fighting and drink and everything else.
Yeah.
So the next day, the king meets with Wat Tyler and the Kentish rebels. And, again, they think the king is on their side. And the king tells them to go back home. And Wat Tyler's saying, I'm not going back home until we've got the charters and we've got our agreement. And they made various demands, and the king agreed to them all. And then it's thought that Wat Tyler was drunk, and that he raised a flagon of ale to his mouth and then spat at the king because he didn't believe the king was going to do what he said. We don't know if that's true or not. But one of the advisors to the king, and this is where Wat Tyler got massively shafted, said that he saw Wat Tyler and pointed him out as the greatest thief and robber in all of Kent. And he went to strike Wat Tyler. And the mayor of London, who was a pretty hard customer, was standing next to the king. And because Wat Tyler had defended himself against this guy who went to strike him, he was then able to strike Wat Tyler. And he gave him a deep cut on the neck and another cut on the head. And that was basically the end of Wat Tyler. He then stabbed him through the belly and basically killed him. Now, Tyler attempted to ride back to his men. But he was on they said he was on a donkey, but I think we can assume he was on a horse.
Yeah.
But because he was wounded, his men weren't sure what to do. And if they'd shot at that point,
just attacked.
They still had enough people to beat the king's army, but they hesitated. And then the young king rode out to them and said, it's okay, your demands are going to be met, disperse. And so they did disperse.
Oh, wow.
And they believed the king. And they all went back home. And Wat Tyler's head was put on a pole and placed on London Bridge. And then John o' Gaunt's armies returned, and they went round all the countryside and rounded up all the troublemakers, all the ringleaders. And if you had a charter granting your freedom, that became your death warrant.
Oh, my goodness.
Because it meant you had been at the battle and been one of the troublemakers. So these charters that granted your freedom actually meant you got executed.
Execution orders, yeah, betrayal.
And many of the ringleaders, apologized and were pardoned, but most were betrayed. But the one man who wouldn't bow down, and he made no apology, was John Ball. And the Bishop of London, he was found in Coventry, and the Bishop of London like begged him to repent because he'd get off. He went, no, I'm not doing it. And so he lost his life and he was beheaded. So all in all, for the people doing it, the peasants' revolt was a failure because many of them were killed and they lost their lives and their family, so on. But the impact of it meant that Parliament stopped trying to cap wages. It stopped trying to suppress this underclass. Lords increasingly gave serfs their freedom. England didn't see another poll tax for 300 years. And it also meant that the effort in the 100 Years' War got reduced. And eventually, I think we kind of lost the 100 Years' War. But because there wasn't the taxes to pay for it.
Yeah.
But England's aversion to poll taxes never went away. And then when Margaret Thatcher was in power, she tried to levy this local charge called
flat rate
community charge. But her ideological enemies, branded it the poll tax.
Yeah,
and it created this huge tax rebellion.
It's crazy,
and it was what eventually did for Thatcher.
Framing and all this stuff.
Oh my
politics is just Wow.
She levied this community charge because our local councils, our local government were nuts. Like everything. It's exactly the same stuff that's going now. Everyone was Hitler.
Yeah.
If you disagreed, we had these stupid loony left. It was where the phrase loony left was council. One council banned the word family from council literature because it was discriminatory. And in a London authority in London made pupils write protest letters as part of their timetable. Thatcher's trade union legislation was equated with Hitler. I mean, it was nuts. And she was trying to make local government accountable. So she introduced this community charge, but instead of, and so everyone's taxes went through the roof. But instead of people blaming the local councils, they blamed Thatcher.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the local councils were totally inept at collecting the money.
You know what it is? It's like Stockholm syndrome, right? When you're being abused and somebody comes and stops the abuser and you're mad at the person who stopped the abuser. It's a psychological thing. And she didn't foresee that. Yeah. This whole peasants revolt, it reminds me of the bully on the playground, right? Where if you finally stand up to the bully, he might whoop your ass, but he's going to think twice next time he tries to fight you because you got a couple punches in.
I think that's exactly what it is. Yeah. And if you just got a couple of punches right, maybe you'd kicked him in the gonads a little bit harder, you might actually have beaten him.
Yeah. He's going to think twice next time.
But
he might give you a black eye and knock you down, but next time he's going to mess with you. You're not an easy target anymore.
It was good for their successors, but it wasn't good for them. But they came within a whisker of overthrowing everything.
Yeah.
And who knows what would have happened had they won, but they came within a whisker.
It reminds me of, remember that whole thing that was happening with Putin and Russia with the guy about, I think it was maybe a year ago or so, maybe 2 years ago, with his guy, one of his main chiefs. I can't remember the guy's name. They supposedly he died on a plane.
Oh yeah.
Well, but he took his retinue and his troops, and they were marching on Moscow.
Yeah.
And he stopped right before. So that was a really interesting one.
Yeah, there's been lots of moments like that. I mean, Hitler was within sight of Moscow, wasn't he? And then the equipment stopped working in the winter.
Yeah,
If he'd just gone a month, if he delayed various reasons, he wanted to take Yugoslavia and it went on. But if he'd just gone a couple of months earlier, he might have taken Moscow.
The world might be a very different place.
Yeah. I think looking back, if he had his life again, he would not bother trying to take Russia. But anyway, so yeah, that was the Peasants' Revolt, one of the great tax rebellions in history and one of the great sort of episodes that make you proud to be an English peasant.
I think the last part of this chapter, Henry VII, do you recall? He got into power and there was not a lot of war or anything like that.
Yeah, Henry VII we had the War of the Roses between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, and he won from the I want to say he was the House of Lancaster. Yes, he was. And then he married Elizabeth of York, and he basically stripped the barons of all their power. And but he pursued, instead of pursuing wars overseas, he pursued alliances. And
I thought that was clever with the marriages and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think there was one war in his whole time, in his whole 25-year reign. And I think he was the wealthiest king, and he was the first English king ever to run a surplus.
Yeah, he set up a nice system of law, and
he introduced wool and sheep farming, and that really changed Britain as well, because when you were grazing sheep, there was no land for serfs to work because there was just sheep grazing there. So that also changed the existence of the serf. But then we got, and we had got sound money under Henry VII as well. Lots of advances in coinage and so on. And then, but Henry VII was succeeded by Henry VIII, who on his first day beheaded Henry VII's 2 tax collectors. And Henry VIII, I think broadly speaking, was not a good king.
Really?
So he undid most of the good work of Henry VII. But Henry VII definitely laid the foundations for the Tudors. He was like the first Tudor, and they were one of the greatest houses in British history. And, Elizabeth I was a really golden time, and Elizabeth I would have been a grandchild of Henry VII, I think I'm correct in saying. So Henry VII was succeeded, I think, for his business brain, he was a great king, and he brought wealth to the country, and he changed the economy, and he sort of ended the rule of the barons, if you like, and introduced a new mercantile class. Britain got its first iron forges. But he was succeeded by Henry VIII, who was known as Old Copper Nose, and that's because his head was on the coins, but because they weren't proper money, they were just plated. You would rub the coins, and then his copper nose would appear. And so he totally debased British coinage. So even though he was probably a charismatic man and lots of wives and lots of kids, probably not our greatest king.
And on that, we'll close out this episode.
There's a long history of extremely rich families lending rulers money and then getting extremely rich on the back of it. Fugger the Rich, the German Fugger the Rich, is regarded generally as one of the richest men in history. And at one point, I think his wealth exceeded 3% of European GDP.
That motherfucker.
And motherfucker. He made his money. Firstly, he controlled the gold and copper mines in the Eastern Alps and into Austria and Hungary. So he minted enormous amounts of gold and copper coinage, which he then lent to Charles II of Spain to wage various wars. And then basically, in doing so, he wrapped the king round his finger. And the other way Fugger made his money was by selling absolution, the Middle Ages equivalent of
that's the classic
of carbon credits, I guess. People paid him effectively to buy their place in heaven, and he built much of the basilica in Rome with that money. But he's regarded as one of the richest people in history. But another one of these families that is extraordinarily rich were the Rothschilds, and still very rich today. They run various hedge funds and they involved in the London Gold Fix, and it's just an extremely rich banking family. But one of the people that lent the British government money was Nathan Rothschild in 1798, and all of Pitt's national expenditure between 1793 and 1798 came from loans. He owed £413 million, which is just an extraordinary figure for the time. Rothschild went on to become one of the richest people on earth, but he was also famous for in 1816, after the Battle of Waterloo, the traders in the city were all watching what he did, and he had like horsemen riding at top speed back from the battle with news of the battle. And as his horsemen arrived, he famously began selling British bonds. So the bond market immediately, or gilts as they were known, and the bond market immediately thought that Britain had lost, and he caused something of a crash. And meanwhile, he quietly bought up all the bonds that the rest of the market had sold.
Welcome back to another episode of Cypherpunk. We're moving on to the next. Welcome back, Dominic.
Thank you very much, sir. And today we're going to talk about the origins of income tax.
War, debt, inflation, famine, and income tax.
Well, so many taxes have their origins in war, and income tax is no different. And William Gladstone described it as a colossal engine of finance. And today, income tax accounts for more than 50% of government revenue worldwide. And if you're looking for a single explanation as to how it is that government has grown so big in the modern age, income tax comes a long way to explaining it. It's been the most, from a government point of view, effective tax. It's generated a lot of revenue and it is easy to collect.
What I found fascinating is the story of Henry IV and how they instituted an income tax in 1404. And then afterwards, it was so successful, but then they burned all the records of it. How did that come about? Why did they explain that to me?
Yeah, well, it's the reason that income tax is a sort of fairly recent thing is that income itself is a sort of fairly recent idea. And, we weren't really ordinary people weren't really handling coins until the 13th or the 14th century. And so income, you would give a share of your produce or a share of your labor, tithing. So I guess tithing was early income tax. But yes, it's probably the first example of an income tax that we know of, an actual income tax. It was a one-off thing that Henry IV collected to pay for a war. But then for some bizarre reason, all records of the tax were burnt. And there was the chronicler was a chap called Thomas Walsingham, and he described the tax as vexatious and burdensome. Well, what tax isn't? But he said, describing this tax, I would have inserted these into the details, but Parliament wanted it to be secret forever. And we'll never know why. But perhaps that Parliament of 1404 was wiser than we give them credit for.
I could be wrong, but I feel like the French government did this at some point as well, where they hid the taxes of how they did it or something like that. But I could be wrong. I mean, I could just be out there.
Maybe, I'm sure. I mean, it was a great thing throughout the Peasants' Revolt. They did it. You would go and just burn tax records.
Yeah.
Because then, if you owed money, it's harder to collect. But normally it wouldn't be Parliament burning its own records. It would be people, revolutionaries burning the records. But in any case, the sort of, I think they tried income tax maybe in Sweden or somewhere like that. But in England, we got it with William the Pitt in the Napoleonic Wars. We got our first income tax in 1799. There was a plethora of petty taxes. William Pitt had been trying to he didn't want revolutionary fervour taking hold in Europe after the French Revolution. He was terrified it would spread. And so he spent a lot of money propping up regimes in Europe. And in order to prop them up, he would send British gold abroad. And because of the picture of St. George on the gold sovereigns that he sent, it became known as the Golden Cavalry of St. George. But we ran out of gold. And so we actually came off the gold standard briefly in 1798 or 1799. And then he gave us this income tax, and the income tax didn't raise anything like as much as he was hoping, and they abandoned it in 1801. And then, but at the time it was said of the government, wherever you see an object, tax it. And there was taxes on everything: carriages, wagons, carts, male servants, bricks, glass windows, wallpaper, even on hair powder, dog owners, clocks, watches, coats of arms, anything you can think, there was a tax on it. And we had this sort of plethora of petty taxes, not too dissimilar to France, but not to the same extent. But anyway, Pitt's successor, Addington, got rid of the tax, and then he brought it back again in 1803. But his revision of the income tax worked really well, because what he did is rather than have people declare their income and then pay tax on it, Addington's innovation was to deduct the tax at source.
That son of a bitch.
That mother foe. Because that is one of the reasons income tax is so effective, is the deduction at source.
He also made it, I think it was, Pitts had it 10%, and then he went to 5%.
Yeah.
So he made it a lot.
He made it lower,
the appearance
double,
a lot less, but the revenue doubled.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. There's the classic case of
Laffer curve, right?
Yeah, lower taxes lead to greater revenue, and so people didn't like it. But from the point of view of tax, it succeeded, and it stayed. And then after the Napoleonic Wars had ended, there were lots and lots of petitions against the government to get rid of the tax, and there was a vote in Parliament, and eventually Parliament got rid of the tax and once again destroyed all the records of it. They burnt them all. And but they had sent duplicates to the king, and for some reason the king kept them all, so there are still the records there. But that thing of destroying tax records by the Parliament was pretty unprecedented, except for that Henry IV occasion that we described before. And then we had this great innovator, Sir Robert Peel, who was a great British man. He started the British police force, among other things. And we had all these petty taxes, and one among them was the window tax. And eventually, and the government's finances were in a parlous state. How many times have we said that? And this was in the middle of the 19th century. And so Peel got rid of hundreds of these petty taxes and replaced them with this one simple income tax. And this was 1840, I want to say 1842, I might have got the year wrong. And it was a temporary tax.
3%.
3%, temporary tax. Here we are, 2013, nearly 200 years later, the temporary tax is still going.
Not many people would complain about the 3%.
If only it was 3%, it only hit the highest earners. But
the lesson is that's as old as time.
Yeah, that's another thing that happens with taxes. They start off low, they're introduced as temporary, and they grow and grow and grow, particularly when the taxes work. There are other taxes that don't work and backfire, and they get rid of them.
From the ancient Sumerians to the Muslim Caliphate, to the Tunisian philosophers, to today, to the British, the French. I mean, the lesson repeats itself throughout history. The taxes start reasonable and small, and then they just never kind of go away.
Yeah. So yes, it was 1842, and then Gladstone tried to get rid of it. He was prime minister after Addington, and he tried to get rid of it, and he couldn't. And then Gladstone and Disraeli had all these arguments. Gladstone actually argued that income tax had enabled the Napoleonic Wars to go on for as long as they did. And he's absolutely right. Tax enables war. He didn't like it. He thinks that, to stop war, you need this transparency and accountability. But in any case, by 1875, it was permanent. And you got it in the States. We'll come to it in a second, but you got it first. Abraham Lincoln, 1862, 1863, something like that.
We'll dive into that one in the next chapter.
Yeah.
I believe. So this other idea that I wanted to talk about, which is this idea of financing wars and lending. The conspiracy theory is that this always goes back to this conspiracy theory that because this did happen in 1793 to 1798, Nathan Rothschild, he lent the British government money to continue the war, essentially. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that? And then the most insidious thing about all of this is that this idea of borrowing for war is this idea of easy debt. It just makes wars much easier. And the consequences of all of this borrowing and lending are pushed on to future generations, which is probably one of the worst and most insidious things about it all.
Sure. I regard debt as government debt as effectively a tax on the future. Mm-hmm. And at some point, it needs to be paid. But if you borrow now, it's left to the future to pay it off. And as well as wars being enabled by taxation, they are also enabled by debt. Governments borrow money to pay for wars, and then after the war is over, somehow that debt needs to be paid back. And many wars would not be possible if the cost of that war was immediately and directly felt by the person paying for it. We want to go and, bomb Iraq. Can you give us 20 grand? No. Whereas we're going to go and bomb Iraq, and then later you have your tax deducted at source. It's an entirely different process, and it makes many government actions possible.
I think this is one of the most exciting things about Bitcoin and some of these monies that we're going to use in the future, that the governments can't just arbitrarily print or inflate, or there's real cost to borrowing those assets. They can't just seize them. So
yes, absolutely right. And this is another reason why governments and money need to be separated. And it's not quite known how much the Napoleonic Wars cost, but it's thought that they left the British people in some kind of servitude for at least 50 years, so 2 generations.
Wow.
And I gather World War One, we only paid off our World War One debts about 10 years ago.
Yeah, well, I think I think the knock-on effects of World War One were largely World War Two, which incurred even more debts. Right? Wild.
Yeah, and this story, I mean, and Pitt, by the way, who was the great taxer who had started the wars in the first place, he died with like 40 grand in debt when he died. So he wasn't that good he wasn't that good an administrator. And as I said, we came off the gold standard because we needed to print money to pay from the war, and that cloaked the cost as well as debt itself. So I guess there were three things that enabled British involvement in the Napoleonic Wars, and they all cloaked the cost. And one was coming off the gold standard, two was the introduction of income tax and a plethora of other taxes, and three was this issue of debt. And there's a long history of extremely rich families lending rulers money and then getting extremely rich on the back of it. Fugger the Rich, the German Fugger the Rich, is regarded generally as one of the richest men in history. And at one point, I think his wealth exceeded 3% of European GDP.
That motherfucker.
And motherfucker. He made his money. Firstly, he controlled the gold and copper mines in the Eastern Alps and into Austria and Hungary. So he minted enormous amounts of gold and copper coinage, which he then lent to Charles II of Spain to wage various wars. And then basically, in doing so, he wrapped the king round his finger. And the other way Fugger made his money was by selling absolution, the Middle Ages equivalent of
that's the classic
of carbon credits, I guess. And he made so much money from selling. People paid him effectively to buy their place in heaven, and he built much of the basilica in Rome with that money. But he's regarded as one of the richest people in history. But another one of these families that is extraordinarily rich were the Rothschilds, and still very rich today. They run various hedge funds and they involved in the London Gold Fix, and it's just an extremely rich banking family. But one of the people that lent the British government money was Nathan Rothschild in 1798, and almost all of Pitt's national expenditure between 1793 and 1798 came from loans. And I think in 1798, he owed £413 million, which is just an extraordinary figure for the time. And Rothschild was famous in 1860. Rothschild went on to become one of the richest people on earth, but he was also famous for in 1816, after the Battle of Waterloo. The traders in the city were all watching what he did, and he had like horsemen riding at top speed back from the battle with news of the battle. And as his horsemen arrived, he famously began selling British bonds. So the bond market immediately, or gilts as they were known, and the bond market immediately thought that Britain had lost, and he caused something of a crash. And meanwhile, he quietly bought up all the bonds that the rest of the market had sold. And of course, he had tricked the market. He'd misled the market. And I guess one of the questions is, it's a grey area. How was what he did extremely clever? Yes. Was it immoral? A little bit. But then he was exploiting his status because everyone was watching him. So why not do something different? And if they're too stupid to do their own research,
that's kind of how I feel about
horsemen.
It's like
it's a bit like following tipsters.
Yeah.
And then a tipster tips a dud that he's selling.
Yeah, it's an interesting. Maybe it's a little unethical on his part. But we do have free markets.